plethora of folks from orthopedics, in part because several of us are ortho, does not mean they are not applicable to all specialties at large, right? Especially competitive ones. So we will have a spattering of different specialties along the way, but remember, you can ask us questions about anything, and feel free to, to direct your questions to any faculty panelists in particular. And we can also try to connect you with people we know in disciplines you're particularly interested to. So with that in mind, Krishna, please take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thank you again for joining us. The first session we have on board today is I didn't match or I'm an IMG. What should I do? On this panel, we have lots of folks to introduce. I'd personally like to thank all of you for taking the time to join us on a Sunday morning. First, we have Dr. Claire McDaniel. She is my senior resident at Johns Hopkins. Claire, welcome. We also have Dr. Ficky, who is chair at Johns Hopkins Hospital. Thank you, Dr. Ficky. We have Sukrit Suresh. I don't mean Sukrit have the same last name. I promise we're not related, but we're still part of the giant orthopedic family. Sukrit's my co-intern at Johns Hopkins Hospital. We have Dr. Agarwal, who is a faculty professor of neurosurgery in the Department of Neurosurgery at WashU in St. Louis. We have Dr. Majd Marache, who is a PGY3 at Johns Hopkins Hospital in orthopedic surgery. We also have Dr. Michael Ivan, who is neurosurgery faculty at the University of Miami. Thank you, sir, for joining us today. And last but not least, we have Dr. Drew Smith, who is currently an ENT resident at Texas Tech. Sorry, Dr. Smith. Thank you all for joining us today, and let's get started. So a very common question we get is from your experience, the faculty on the panel, what is the most common reason that a well-qualified applicant, so has the board scores, has the grades, has the clinical acumen, the general skill set during the sub-I, what is the most common reason do you think that a candidate such as this slips through their cracks in competitive specialties? Dr. Ficky, we can start with you, sir.
Okay, thanks, Krishna, for letting me lead off on this. This is a great panel, and we have a lot of great perspectives. Just frame of reference, I've been a chair of both military and civilian matches and orthopedic programs for now going on 17 years, actually. So I started when I was 20. But this is, just really a critical question. I think that whether it's an international graduate or it's or you are an applicant of an allopathic or even an osteopathic program, I will send a link later in this seminar to look at National Resident Match Program data. The first and foremost issues, and I think the context for this is to frame, is how someone who didn't match, who did not, who has scores, has grades, has references, has done all of those things well. And well is relative, right? So we know now that the graduates from this year, step one forward, are not scored. So we look at clinical rotations. We look at at the letters of recommendation. The most common reason that someone who has an average score doesn't match is because there is either a fail on a rotation or a fail on a standardized test, or there's a letter of recommendation that creates a red flag. The most common red flag by the national NRMP, it has to do with ethics or professionalism. And so understanding, we talked yesterday about letters of recommendation. We talked about sort of the sponsorship and mentoring programs. And so I think that we'll talk more about why, but if we look at just some numbers, 94% in 2021 of allopathic applicants matched, 85% of osteopathic US citizens matched. It goes to 60% if you're a US international medical graduate, meaning you went to a US citizen in an international program, and it's 58% for a non-US citizen. as an international medical graduate applying to U.S. programs. These are different in different programs, but in orthopedics, for the world that I live in, it's even less. So the 2020 data for international medical graduates, if you're a U.S. citizen applying for orthopedics, there were 24 in 2020 and 5 matched. If you're a non-U.S. citizen applying for an orthopedic program in the U.S., 7 out of 22 matched. So it happens, but we're going to talk the rest of this session about what do we do for those who don't match. So thanks, Krishna.
No, thank you so much, Dr. Ficky, for those statistics. I think, based on yesterday's discussion in the social survey, we have a large international medical graduate audience joining us today. Mej, Sukrit, I think you two have very unique perspectives, to contribute. Would you guys mind just taking a couple of minutes and sharing kind of your story about how you got into orthopedics, a very competitive specialty, as an IMG candidate? What was your pathway to circumvent the statistical boundaries that Dr. Ficky just mentioned? Sukrit, we can start with you.
Sure. Can you hear me okay, Krishna?
Yep.
Great. I have a lot to say on this topic. I'm going to try and sort of keep it as brief as I can. It's certainly been a very convoluted path, and a path where I had particular plans in my mind, but I've had to adapt them along the way. For me, it took about 3 to 4 years to get in. And if I was to go back in time, I would do exactly the same thing again. But you've got to keep yourself in the running. Before you make the decision to pursue this path from being from abroad, there's a few things to consider, in my opinion, when I was thinking about this whole journey now. Number one is finances. So it's a fairly big financial investment to take the USMLE exams, to buy the resources such as the questions and the books, to actually apply for the match as well. And depending on the number of programs you apply for, you've got to bear that in mind. For me, tallying up the finances, it was probably coming close to around $6,000 to $10,000 if you add everything up for one application cycle. So just bear that in mind in the timeline that you have. I was moonlighting in the emergency room in England when I was trying to sort of get some extra finances between these sorts of steps along the way. So just number one, that's something to consider. Number two is the visa situation. So there's limited visas available. In general, there's a H-1B visa or there's a J-1 visa. But something I didn't know when I was applying the first time around is there's a lot of rules that come attached to these. So for example, the J-1 visa is the most commonly sought medical professional visa if you're coming from abroad to come to the US, because it's fairly quick and straightforward process once you're given an offer from an institution. But something that I didn't know with that journey is that you cannot bounce back and forth between doing a clinical visa and then a research visa and then coming back onto a clinical visa. So for example, let's say you do a 1-year clinical job in America. You then go on to do a research position after that. If you do that research position on a J-1 visa, there's very strict rules which prohibit you from coming back onto a physician visa, and you have to find ways to circumvent that if possible. So these are some important things to consider. I didn't know this at the time when I was applying, so I had to think about alternatives. So that's what I just wanted to start off with. In terms of my own journey, so I completed medical school in London. I did my internship in London, and then that's when I felt, okay, I had my registration in England, and now is the time where I wanted to pursue and take some risks along the way. I had always had an ambition to pursue residency training in the US, and especially at Hopkins, ever since I was selected to do an elective at Hopkins for a month back in 2015. Little did I know 7 years later, I was going to be back here as a PGY1, but here we are. So I applied 3 years ago. I did not match. I got some feedback from professors who said, hey, you need to come and try and get some serious US clinical experience. So then that year I went through the scramble or the SOAP process, and I managed to SOAP into a preliminary surgical position in Brooklyn, which was a very eye-opening experience. But one which definitely gave me that US clinical experience, which I needed. Number two, I applied again that following year. Once again, I did not match. Again, I really sought to different professors and mentors along the way in terms of some feedback in terms of how can I bolster my application more because I'm serious about this. And a lot of people mentioned a research year. So that's exactly what I did. I poured my heart and soul into that research year in terms of trying to get as many projects done, invest the time with the residents as well, and really trying to distinguish myself and stand out at an institution. And thankfully, this third year when I applied, I managed to get in. I was very close to giving up on the process about a year ago. I was probably a couple of months away from booking my ticket back to England and just, giving up on this whole journey. But I had a few reasons why I really wanted to give it that one last shot, to not have any regrets for myself in the future, thinking back at this point in my life. In pursuing this journey, I think the most important thing, apart from obviously scores, research, getting clinical experience, from my own perspective, is having a plan A, plan B, and a plan C as an international medical graduate. So let's say you have a plan, you've got to think about, okay, if this plan doesn't work out this year, what's going to be my next plan A, plan B for next year? If it doesn't work out that year, what's going to be my plan A, plan B, plan C for that next year? And there's always avenues available if you really want it. 99 out of 100 people, especially for a competitive specialty for an IMG, may say no. But you just got to have that one person who's willing to sort of have your back. And most importantly, you've got to be willing to know what you're willing to go through to get that position if it really means everything to you. So that's sort of a bit about my journey. If I can do it, I don't see why anybody else can't do it. Put the hard work in. If you put the hard work in and you keep yourself in the running, Dr. Ficky had a sit down with me about a year ago about serendipity, and it definitely is about being in the right place at the right time. And the only way you're able to be in that right place is if you're keeping yourself in the running and you keep yourself on the treadmill and keep going. So that's a bit about my own sort of journey and a few pieces of advice I have. Happy to answer any more questions if they come along.
Thank you so much, Sukrit, for that insight. You mentioned a very valid point. You tried multiple times to get into residency. So Dr. Ivan, Dr. Agarwal, Mej, you can even comment on this. So this is a very controversial question, but is there a certain number of attempts, whether you're IMG or whether you're a US medical graduate, that let's say you're applying to neurosurgery or you're applying to orthopedics, applying to plastics, that if you don't match, that you recommend trying an alternative course? Because as we know, the statistics say that every year you don't match, whether you're an IMG or whether you're a US medical grad, your chances of securing a position the subsequent year decreases. In orthopedics, that's as much as 50%. So Dr. Ivan, Dr. Agarwal, Mej, any comments on how many attempts should someone try before they switch course for neurosurgery, for example? Dr. Ivan, we can start with you, sir.
Right. Yeah, no, thank you so much for inviting me to talk. It's really an honor. This is a passion of mine on the neurosurgery side, is to really help mentor and whatnot. And Nitin and I have actually worked at multiple meetings to kind of put these courses together. So it's so great to see you guys doing this for all surgical specialties. This is a tough question because everybody's situation is so different. And that kind of goes back to how important your mentors are with assessing that situation. I think that's the most important thing up front, is finding mentors that are honest with you, that could really kind of go through the process and the failures with a fine tooth comb to really kind of see, okay, like where is the weakness, where was the gap, and what are you doing to work towards that to actually make a difference in the future application? Sometimes it's just something simple, like people don't apply to enough programs, or they don't apply to the right programs, or they haven't looked in the past at which programs take IMGs and which ones don't. And that's really helpful. Suresh gave some great ideas with the idea of really kind of getting your exposure to the mentors and the people that are out there. And the more times you do these clinical rotations, each failure you have, you get to have a wider net exposure of people in the US that have you could kind of call your mentors and could kind of talk about you and vouch for you on these applications. And in neurosurgery, the field is so small. I mean, you're vying for like, just, somewhere in the 200 number of spots, and there's only like 1,000 academic neurosurgeons. And so we all know each other. And so that communication and that mentorship and the people that are, vouching for you becomes really, really important. That being said, it's hard to kind of increase your publications and your resume as you're doing clinical rotations, right? It's one thing if your research is really the weakness and you take 1 or 2 years off to do publications, because we all know that to get significant publications or publications of significant impact, it's hard to do it in 1 year, right? Many times it does take a year or two to kind of get something substantial. So, for somebody who spends 2 or 3 years in the lab and they're failing at applications every year, but then on the third year they have a Nature publication, then that's a very different story of time kind of that's well invested there to kind of come out with something significant. But many times we see people, do these clinical fellowships year after year, and it's challenging because you're working like a dog, trying to impress the people you're with. You're trying to do research on the side, and you're jumping from program to program each year, and that is definitely wears on you. So I think if you're on that path where you're doing clinical rotations, after the second or third time, it's really tough to make significant improvements on your application at that period of time. One other component of that I just wanted to highlight that Suresh didn't is for IMGs that come in with full residency trainings that are applying to come to the United States. There are some other pathways there that you could do these clinical fellowship years to then kind of help become established as U.S. physicians, and that's kind of a side project. But there are kind of other ways for IMGs to kind of circumvent some of the residency pathways if you've already done a residency in another country.
Thank you so much for that, sir. Dr. Agarwal, anything to add to what Dr. Ivan just said at all?
Well, I remember, first of all, I just want to apologize to you guys. I'll be on video in a second. I'm on call currently, but I remember when I was applying, Dr. Ivan was my mentor that I looked up to because he went to the same med school. So Dr. Ivan, thanks for getting me in. He was about 10 years older. I just want to emphasize that. That being said, this puts me right back to when I was applying. And for all of you, I cannot wish you enough words of encouragement to keep going, keep at it. I think it's a personal choice for each person on how many times you're going to try. My research fellow right now is an absolute just rabid dog, just this extremely hard worker. And before I took him on, we had this conversation and I asked him, what if you don't match the first time? How about the second time? How about the third time? How about the fourth time? And we kept going. And no matter how high I got up to 6 or 7 years. And he just said, I'll keep doing research for you. I'm going to keep working in your lab. Now, that's not for everybody, right? Some other people that we have in the lab or say that, they're going to try for a general surgery pre-residency. So I think the key point of this is that what Dr. Ivan said is you need to have somebody who's going to be an honest mentor with you, review your stats, review your choices, and then you guys have an honest conversation with each other on what is it going to take and what are our backup and contingency plans. So that I cannot emphasize enough. Somebody who's going to be straightforward with you, but go to bat for you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Agarwal. It's kind of a common theme that's kind of been going on throughout this boot camp: honesty and transparency and mentorship. Menj, do you have anything to add about what Dr. Ivan and Dr. Agarwal said in terms of your perspective as an IMG, former IMG applicant? How many times do you think someone should try to get into residency of their choice?
I think I have less to say about this. I applied once to residency, and then thank God I got in. So Sukrit can most accurately describe his journey and how many times he thinks someone should apply. But honestly, I think at some point after 2 tries, you should take a step back and think, what are your priorities? How much are you willing to invest? Like Sukrit said, financially, not only financially, mentally, how many times can you accept this, so to speak, I don't want to say failure, but this, so to speak, rejection. And what is your backup plan? You have to, I think one of the biggest advice I got is, like Sukrit said, plan A, plan B, plan C. At what point do you look back and say, you know what, I'm going to go back home, do my residency, and then I come back for fellowship or I come back for another residency. And that is an extremely viable option, but it all depends on what your priorities are and how many times you're willing to take that rejection. If you're Sukrit, probably he'll try 5 more times, but that's Sukrit.
So I'm gonna jump in with this because it pertains to a question just got asked about not matching and then reapplying while you're in the thick of your research year initially. So many of you know, but for those who do not, I went unmatched the first time around. And just to give you some backstory, I had pretty good scores, pretty good grades, was barely missed AOA at the time, was class president, had 17 interview offers, went on 13, went unmatched. And the program that was unfilled that year was a program that I had ranked, so they had not ranked me. It was obviously very clear. The going through that at the end, the biggest, I looked back very carefully at my application, the biggest deficit was for me, the research involvement, right? So I could see very easily why the program said, how committed is this kid? Is this sort of just like a fluff thing, or is he really interested in doing orthopedics for the remainder of his life? And I could understand compared to how competitive others are and how much more committed they probably appeared on their applications at a minimum. So with that being said, I took a year off, and I got very lucky that the person I worked with in Philadelphia had a very keen understanding of the process, understood what was necessary, understood there was only a handful of months between the time of not matching in March to graduating technically. I defer graduation, but graduating technically in May, June, and then reapplying in September. So the reality is it is a very short period of time. And I'm going to direct this question to Dr. Ivan, to Dr. Ficky in a second. But the reality is, if you're looking to apply again, first time, second time, as Maj was mentioning, or more, as in Sukrit's case, then the reality is you have to know your application's strengths, the weaknesses, and what you're strategically doing to improve upon them. So the next time around, you can not only take advantage, try to improve upon that, but you can have mentors advocate for you, support, say, hey, we're working with this person to improve upon XYZ things. Here they are taking the feedback and moving forward with it. So on that humble note, I'll ask the question. When you see someone who's in the middle of a research year, Dr. Ficky, like they didn't match this past cycle, they're going to apply again in the fall, and they're now in a research year, there may not be a lot on their application. Is that a problem for you? Is that worrisome? Or is it like, maybe you should have taken 2 years and then reapplied, or is it okay? And then I'll take the same question to Dr. Ivan after Dr. Ficky responds.
Well, that's the nature of research, right? It's a delayed gratification, in many ways. So if I could wind that question a little bit back, for the sake of this, having a conversation first, is actually, because Sukrit called this out, and for disclosure, at the happy hour last night, I didn't give your name, but I called this out. And to speak about tenacity and serendipity and some big multisyllabic words that we orthopedic surgeons don't always have. The notion of sitting at the middle point of a research year is already after, it's kind of too late. So I think that the conversation should be when you're considering those. And I saw a couple of chat questions about this. Having a conversation with a person about going into research versus going into doing a clinical or some extended way, like you said, you deferred your graduation or some choices. Those will come through the conversation in the remaining session. But I think what I would say to somebody is, if you're in research, if you've chosen to do a research year, and as we learned really with Sukrit, we've got to make sure that we cross the T's and dot the I's to ensure they can get some clinical exposure. One that's important for the differences in training programs for an international medical graduate, but it's also one that we want to see an individual's ability to interact. So if you're in a research year and you're able to spend some time in a clinic, some way to do that is really critical. That's the conversation I will have. I will have with anyone that's doing a research year, whether you're an IMG or an unmatched, or you're choosing to take a gap and do research. Don't expect to have tangible results. And I don't, as a chair, expect to see tangible results when you're applying because you just started. What I expect to see and to hear from your sponsor or your mentor is that you're in the lab, or that you're doing the registries, you're doing the clinical work, the research work, and you understand the mechanism there. So what I want to hear from an advocate for someone doing a research year is that their person is working hard, that they have the grit and the work ethic to get the job done. Over.
No, thank you so much for that, Dr. Bickey. I think, an interesting point you mentioned, we talked about taking a research here, and this actually came up in the Q&A just now. Last year, for orthopedic surgery specifically, we had a lot of unmatched candidates who are actually ranked on the rank list, but weren't ranked high enough and subsequently went unmatched. For these candidates, I'd love to hear from Drew, Claire, and Dr. Bickey about this. Obviously one avenue is that research here that you just mentioned, sir. But is there any other avenue that someone could consider to increase the chances of matching other than a research year, potentially? Or is research year kind of the one shot, this is what you're supposed to be doing kind of thing after not matching? Drew, we can start with you.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with this panel. Kind of sharing my background, and as I answer this question, I went unmatched the first cycle that I applied to ENT. I did a research year and was fortunate to match the second cycle. So for me, the research year was the best fit. I think it kind of, I was coming from a medical school where I didn't have a home ENT program, research options were limited. So as I did the research year, I really was able to kind of step it up in that area. But I kind of just mentioned this in one of the Q&A questions. I think it's important to look at the places that you interviewed, get feedback from them, figure out where you could improve. That was very helpful for me the second time around. And I also used a lot of those opportunities with those programs who had interviewed me to kind of make stronger connections there. I did research projects with some of the programs. I attended virtual events during the COVID years with them, and I believe some of those are still going on. And I actually ended up matching the second time around at one of those programs who had interviewed me the first year. So I think that's important. And then the other biggest piece of advice I think I would give is really focusing on the interview itself. When we think about our colleagues in business, when they interview for very important positions within a company, they spend a lot of time preparing for the interview. And I don't think for residency, there's quite enough emphasis on the preparation that really there should be. We don't get a lot of formal interview training in medical school. So that was something I spent a lot more time the second time around as I applied. Went out reading books about interviewing, practicing much more with colleagues and people from my medical school. And those are some of the things that really made a difference for me the second time around.
And I totally agree with Drew. I come from a business background. I have an MBA, and part of that academic degree is formal interview training. We are told to treat every job interview like it is a task. So you need to prepare for it. You need to treat it almost like you're preparing for a case where you write your notes and you have your plan before you go into the OR. The same thing before you do an interview. I do think that in medicine, it's just kind of this other step, the way we take step one, the way you do research, then you perform an interview, but you're not really told how to do that. You need to be able to pitch yourself as someone that the program would want. You need to pitch yourself as a team player, as academically focused, as willing to learn and grow within that program. And I think it's important to do things like something called a tell me about yourself or a team A. Have 3 things about yourself that you can expand on for 20 seconds, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, what have you. I also think you need to know and have a plan of attack to address any weaknesses that you might have in your application. Although for me, I had research on my application, I wasn't 10 or 20 papers deep into it. So I knew that was my weakness. And I went in knowing I was going to be asked about that and knowing I was going to have need to have a response to that. If you prepare notes about the program, you're going to be interviewed, and then notes about yourself as well, because you won't always remember things. An ethical situation that you had to address is a very common question. Someone that you learned from or someone you aspired to be like. These are very common interview questions that medical students and reapplicants aren't prepared for all the time, because it's just not what we're used to. It's not, a fact that we're asked to recall or a multiple choice question we're asked to answer. So if you treat it like a task and you prepare and you do your homework, I think that's critical to success.
If I could just add a couple comments too. There's so much great information being passed on, but for the interviews, it's also important for you to practice on Zoom. I know for neurosurgery this year, it's going to be on Zoom again. And, as a student, you probably don't get a lot of one-on-one kind of Zoom time, or at least see yourself on Zoom a lot, and just something simple like blinking or not moving your head or just the way that you kind of come across on Zoom may be totally different than how you would be in person. And it's important for you to kind of train for that interview, because it really is just, a few minutes that you get with the program and the people that you're on there. And it could make a really big impact when you have two candidates that are very, very similar. And that's basically your last kind of point of decision to kind of really go which way. The other point is going back to the research here just for 1 second, is that, I think when you're talking about somebody who gets a lot of interviews and then doesn't match is totally different than somebody who doesn't get hardly any interviews and is really just struggling to kind of break that door open, right? If you're getting interviews and then you're trying to improve your research, you do have a little bit more time than your application process, because by the time you interview, that's a couple more months into the year. And even after your interview, you still have time to kind of update the program directors and the programs to be like, I've been productive in the lab year. I've only been here for 4 or 5 months, but I already have 2 clinical papers. I have another lab paper coming out, and you kind of keep them updated through the cycle and kind of show them that you're being productive. And additionally, you try to pick also a separate research person that you haven't already spent with, so that now you're getting an additional letter of recommendation, which is what kind of Dr. Fickey was saying, is that you want somebody else to kind of now vouch for you and tell somebody that you're a hard worker, not just somebody that's been doing that for the last year. But it could work to hurt you. And I've seen this also happen, in neurosurgery a lot. We see people that either taken a year off in between their 3rd and 4th year, or they're after their 4th year, or they have a PhD. And they come in with 2 papers from their research year, and then you have somebody who didn't take a year off and they come in with 10 papers, and you're like, what did you do with that year? What'd you do? You have a PhD and you only have 3 papers, like, unless one of those is in science, that's going to be a major negative to you. So you have to be real careful with when you do that year of exactly picking the right people, the right mentors, the right team. People that have kind of had people come through their lab or their research kind of program before are able to kind of fast track you onto some of the projects in order to be productive, and not that it's going to take a year or 2 to kind of get a publication. So those are just a couple fine words.
Yeah, I would definitely echo that. If you're going to take time off, it's got to be a productive year, because that's something we immediately notice as a red flag, and it's hard to overcome that.
Yeah, that also, if you're doing it, if you're going to invest the year, the question of whether to ask your research mentor to be a letter writer for your letters of recommendation was a topic yesterday, and it's the idea that you're spending a whole year and you don't have something to show for it, I think is a red flag, regardless of what, we talk about. I saw in the Q&A that there's a question about international red flags. A question for anyone that didn't match is what have you done to change it? To call out Sukrit's success, Sukrit did something different every single time. He came and he did a clinical exposure, clinical rotation. He got interviews. He worked on improving his interview skill. He did an internship at a U.S. institution. Each year was a different try, a different way to do it. The same way every time is insanity. So red flags are not to have something to show for the time that you've invested, I think the comments about interview skills are, I think about one of our students that didn't match initially, and we sat and talked about interview skills, and that is something for all 93 attendees who are applying, is seek out from your mentor, or if that mentor says, I'm not really good at that, then find a different, don't fire them, but find that mosaic of mentors. Find a mentor that can help you, that maybe has an MBA, or that can speak publicly, or that is as extroverted as Dr. Iyer. To look for people who will teach you how to do that. I think about this just in the one-on-one Zoom methodology. We're probably doing it that way too. We want to do in person, and we're going to try to pursue that, but you have to be prepared for both. And as Claire said, just look at this. I recommend, if somebody can do it, if their medical school allows them to not, if they didn't match, to allow them to extend and not defer their graduation, and then do clinical rotations, because the way you have connectivity with individual programs is to be able to do rotations and then thrive and show your ethics, show your work, show your professionalism, show kind of reverse those notions that whatever happened in other places. So I think I'll leave it at that.
And just to piggyback off of that a little bit, most undergraduate institutions, no matter how long ago you graduated, will have a career center and can set up a mock interview with you. They might not have a specialty in medicine, but they do have a specialty in the basics of interview skills. And so they can ask you the common interview questions, things about tell me about yourself, things like that. And you can practice on them before you go to your real interviews.
Yeah, and there's a lot of online resources you can use too. You can literally just Google mock interview, and you can set up an appointment. And it doesn't really have to be a medical interview. It's just the same theme as tell me about yourself. What are your weaknesses, your strengths? These are all answers that you have to have in your back pocket. I would say even before your interview process, when you're doing an elective or a sub-I or whatever, you will be asked those, why orthopedics, why ENT, why plastics. You have to have that answer, and you shouldn't stumble with answering those questions.
I was just going to chime in with to kind of address a couple of points, because I think there's some really valuable messages that are coming through. As far as the research year and the time related to that, as you do want to be productive, right? So I always get asked the question, is it quantity versus quality? Obviously, and I'll put it this way, you want a high number of quality publications, right? And so when we encourage people who are, or mentors, or PIs who have a high degree of turnover, usually means they're very engaged academically, right? These are often people that many students will gravitate towards because of the fact that they may have the ability to sort of very accelerate the mentorship, accelerate the ability to advocate and sponsor you as you're moving through the cycle. But that in and of itself, right? You get an opportunity. Some opportunities are probably going to be more fruitful acutely than others, depending on the type of research. Like I did a bunch of basic science research, so I only ended up having like one publication that probably came out my second year of residency, but I ended up having a ton of abstracts, posters, and presentations that came out of the work I had done in a very short period of time. But to that end, some programs, Dr. Ficky was really kind about saying, hey, like, I'm going to recognize you're in the middle of a research year. Not everything may be ready or published yet, but other programs may not be as kind of like, okay, so where is it? And as you heard on the neurosurgery side. So you have to, and that may even vary from program to program. So just bear in mind that if you're going to go down that research path, you want to be as productive as you can be. But again, the goal is always as high a number of quality publications, because as we talked yesterday, the research is contributing to literature, which can help direct patient care, which is something we want to do our best in at the end of the day. As far as the interviewing is concerned, I would probably say that out of all the kids who did not, one of the biggest themes of kids who were super strong on paper, but then didn't match, assuming they had advocates, is because of the fact that they could not interview virtually. And interviewing virtually, talking virtually like this, very different vibe than in person, because it's a whole paradigm shift, right? I mean, if you still, we still have Zoom 2 years later, we had Zoom technical difficulties yesterday, right? So it's the nature of the beast. It's a bit, the ball is not in your court as a student in the virtual environment. It's in the program's court, because all the flaws, all the all the different like looking around, that all comes out like in the virtual interview. It may not come out nearly as much in person. But that being said, I agree with Dr. McDana, Dr. Marash about practicing and with friends, family, whomever, practice the in-person, practice the virtual, especially because now there may be some hybrid models. But do that, and do that as often as you can, because you don't need to have answers scripted per se. But I will tell you that the more you have, I want to talk about XYZ things when tell me about yourself, which is such a generic cliche question. You don't want to just say, well, I was born here, did this. You want to have that story very parsed out. So if where you were born is critical to that, then great. But if you have a story that kind of hits on key themes that tells about your interest in neurosurgery or derm or ortho or whatever, then you want to be able to get through that in a very succinct fashion, because it means you've put thought into it. It comes off very mature, which is what you want to portray yourself as. Whether you really are or not, it's a different story. But it's very important because these are people who are looking to you as future colleagues, right? And that sense of maturity really needs to, you want to exude that as much as possible. And so practicing it as much as you can in person or or virtually can be super important.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Iyer. So just the key takeaways, a lot of pearls there in that discussion, but the emphasis on being productive and having something to show for a research year, kind of maintaining clinical experience if possible, and having excellent interview skills through practice. Going off that topic, open to all the panelists, I got this question just recently. How do you know what a good research year is when you're choosing to take one versus same thing with a prelim or a clinical year? How do you know where to go that'll set you up for success your subsequent MAC cycle? And we could approach this in two separate questions. So the first question is, Sukrit, Drew, Mej, anyone who did a research year, how did you know what to pick? The quality of the research program you're getting into to set you up for success? And then we could follow that up with, how do you know what prelim year to take if you didn't match the first time? Sukrit, we could start with you.
I think if you're in the luxurious position of being able to choose, then great. You can, perhaps it would be good to do research at a bigger academic institution because you have a lot of mentors who have the ability to get you involved in many projects and give you the guidance that you need to churn out different projects very quickly. I think having spoken to at least 3 or 4 people who have not matched this year, who I know here in the US, I think most people are not in that luxurious position to make that decision. The 1 or maybe 2 programs they end up getting the position for, they have to commit to, and then they have to try and make the most of that year. And as you yourself know, Krishna, a big part of a research year is how much work you as an individual are willing to put into it, which directly translates into how much you get out of it. You can have amazing mentors all around you, but it's ultimately up to you having a sort of structure yourself when it comes to a research year, in terms of reaching out to different people, seeing various different projects you can get involved with, for example, with Dr. Vicky, with Dr. Iyer, with Dr. Sponseller, like I did, and then having a structure for each day of the week where you have a clear plan. So you're going to come in on Monday, you may do rounds in the morning, you may go and do some clinic that day, but then Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, you do your rounds in the morning and you're like, okay, I need to get through this particular aspect of this paper or this particular aspect of another paper. So I think if you get an offer for a research year, you've already done very, very well. And I think after that, it's sort of independent. You've got some mentors around you, but you've got to come up with a structure early on in that year in terms of how you're going to gear it and how you're going to play it for a year, in terms of maximizing the number of publications that you get. And as Dr. Iyer said, the quality of publications that you get. And finally, going on to what Dr. Vicky mentioned, aside from just the publications, a big part for me was thinking, okay, what else can I be doing alongside just the research? So whether that was spending some time in clinic with the residents, trying to take some on-calls with the residents, trying to just have some one-to-one time with them to get some honest feedback and some, guidance along this journey. I think it's a very, very valuable year for a number of different reasons. And I also know a few other people in orthopedics who have matched as IMGs, and a lot of people, a recurring theme that kept coming up was the place that you do research as an IMG, realistically, even if you get interviewed for 20 programs, in a way is probably your highest chance of getting into that program. And I suppose that the reason for that is because you're really able to invest that time and effort and make a very big influence on the people around you, be they attendings or residents, everyone. So I think a research year has a lot of sort of, it's very good. It helps your application a lot. In terms of the prelim year as well, again, if you're in a luxurious position to make the decision in terms of option A, B, or C, great. I think when I SOAPed, I had 2 offers. I interviewed at 2 places which came through on the SOAP application, but then the second one didn't even end up interviewing me, sort of just blanked me. So I had 1 place where I was going to go. Now, little did I know that I was going to end up meeting my soon-to-be fiance there, but I wouldn't change it for the world, you know. I am so happy with the decision I made. I ended up working with a fabulous group of people. I got tremendous experience in trauma in Brooklyn. And again, that bolstered my application, and it gave me a lot to talk about at my interviews at Hopkins and elsewhere in terms of experience. So that would be my take on it. One other thing I just wanted to say also, Krishna, sorry, I'm taking a bit of time, is yes, I talk about all these ups and downs and hurdles along the way, but reflecting on the whole journey now, I had an amazing time each of those years. In Brooklyn, I had an amazing time getting that experience. In my research year, I had an amazing time. I think Medj was the first resident who I bumped into on my research year. He took me under his wings. He told me, you're coming in at this time. We're going to get through this, and you know, we're going to make a good impression. And he guided me for that first month when I was there, when I felt so uneasy at the beginning on this whole journey. So I actually have had an amazing experience by keeping yourself in the running, and by having that sort of motivation to keep going. You just underestimate a lot of good things that come along the way as well.
Yeah, I'll chime in here. I think Sukrit said it really, really nicely. Your research year is probably going, if you decide to take the research route, is definitely the most important or most challenging, I'd say, year of your life. And that's what I called Sukrit the first day he was here, or the second day. I called him, I'm like, Sukrit, this is going to be the hardest 6 months of your life. You're going to be here. Your prelim is nothing compared to this research year. You're going to be here at 5 a.m. This is how you have to do it. This is me not even involved in his research year. I was just telling him that how things should be, and everyone should try to mimic what Sukrit did, is convert your research year into an experience. Not only research is fine, it's good, and I think it's a way to build experience for the future. But I think the more important part of your research year is, one, building relationships with your mentors, which is the most important, building relationship with residents, which is the second most important, getting to know every single resident you can, working with every single resident you can, and then meeting the faculty. Go to every journal club, go to every grand rounds, go to every single thing that people know who you are by the end of your research year. And I think going back to what Dr. Ivan was saying, 1 year, I think personally is not enough if you're an IMG, because once you start your year, I think in July, you're basically applying. If you do 1 year, you're basically applying in September or whatever it is. No one knows you. You haven't been there enough for people to know you, for you to be productive or anything like that. So take a year, get to know people, do good research, be productive, and apply on the second year around. And that's what I got.
Dr. Ficky.
Yeah, Krishna, I think this session is hopefully helpful. And there's a lot of questions. I think that there is also the ugly side of just not making it, and having, this is a really place I hate to be in with a candidate or a mentee, where you kind of, none of us want to have a conversation to say, I just don't think you're going to make it. But that honest conversation has to take place occasionally. And so is it possible to match if you have low scores or fail? The odds are so against that. If, the average scores, USMLE, we're probably, people are going to probably look at step 2 now, the way they did with step 1, and you can look at programs that are friendly, and it's hard to know who those are. And you have to kind of get on the websites of these places and contact the residency coordinator or residency directors to understand it. But I think that if your scores, or if you've failed some rotations, if you've failed any standardized scores, you really have to have a critical reflection. I said this in the chat, that having a reflection and actually having a mentor who's honest to trust and say, this is an uphill battle, is a conversation that, can be the best thing for you at some point. I think all of us feel very fortunate that we're in the specialties that we pursued. I had to wait 2 years to do this. It wasn't a non-match, but in the military, that was mandatory to do. It's not anymore. But the second year, I was about as depressed as I've ever thought I could be, because what if I don't make orthopedics? I don't know. It was orthopedics or bust. But understand that if you have a mentor that can sit down and say, I can't say you won't make it, but I can say it's a big challenge. And so what else are alternatives? And we've had some people that have chosen to do other things. And I have a couple of good friends that have done that even when I was training. And so that may be the best option. But somebody who knows you and can be an accountable partner for you is also just as valuable as all these things we've been talking about.
I think picking that right mentor is really important. I wouldn't be where I am right now if it weren't for my mentor for med school. And I wouldn't be where I am right now if it weren't for my mentor in residency. That mentor has to be well-connected. That mentor has to be able to give you the resources to succeed. And that mentor has to be brutally honest with you. So anybody that I take in my lab, the first thing we talk about is, what are your backup plans if you don't match? What are your strategies going forward? I think mentorship is something that is so key, especially if you're at a disadvantage to begin with. And I know everybody says that, but I mean, it's truly important. In other words, you need to look at that person. Anybody will take you for a research here because people want to have people to do research with them, but good mentors will be very selective in who they take, and they will really invest a lot of time and effort in you. So you need to pick who is that person who's going to be connected, give you those resources, and be brutally honest.
Yeah, and just to kind of comment on those thoughts too with Nitin is what does well connected mean? You have just 3 letters to kind of choose from, and you want those to be as impactful as you can. So there's a couple different ways to look at it, which may not be shared by everybody. But if you're at Harvard and you're not matching, do you really want to spend another year there making a mentor that is in a program where you're probably not going to get into, or do you want to take that year and kind of go to a program that you really is kind of in your range of where you're going to get into? And then the second way to look at it is, thinking about who's on the round table of the application review process, right? It's going to be faculty and residents. And typically everybody has a say in that application decision. But you notice that there's not PhDs on the application table. There's not community physicians on the application table. And these are great people to work with. But when it comes down to the day, you want to have somebody at that table that knows you, work with you, and could really share their personal experience with you, not just based on reading your application and kind of hearing from somebody else. You want to have somebody up there that's fighting for you. So if I were to take a year off and spend it with somebody, I would want to pick somebody who I know is going to be at that table and is going to be able there to fight for me and really kind of advocate for me and their experience. And that's when Nitin says well connected. That's kind of a very more specific way of who is well connected in this plan.
And I want to give you one more thought. Mike and I are on a lot of these different review committees for awards, for abstracts, for just outside of even residency. And when we get to review things, you just get inundated, right? So we have all these things we're doing for patient care and for research, for journal, for reviews, but then you have all these extra things like, okay, review these 50 abstracts and then pick one award winner. So all of these people have letters of rec and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And when I'm reading these, if I see Mike Ivan's name come up, I'm going to stop and I'm going to read the whole letter. And if you have a Mike Ivan fighting for you, right, or you have one of another person that I know well that's involved, invested in those types of things, it's going to resonate. That person's going to stick with me, and they're probably going to get a little bit of boost. So it is equally important for you to be productive and all those things, but you need to have that other person. Your battle shield needs to be equally as strong as the soldier behind it, and that battle shield is your mentor.
I love that analogy for one, and I'll kind of just ask a question in response. So the common thought is, irrespective of this particular topic, is should I get a letter from someone famous, or I'm going to go rotate at XYZ institution. I'm going to go to University of Miami to rotate with Dr. Ivan because he's famous. And is that a reason to is that reason enough to get a letter for them, kind of along the lines of what you're describing? Or is it important to consider your ability to kind of, really make a connection with this individual who's well connected as you're describing? Is that even more important versus just like, hey, I'm just going to go to UM or anywhere else for that matter to kind of work with someone who's well known, if you will?
I'm going to be very controversial here. Famous does not equal amazing battle shield. I think there's a big difference in the two, and I think you need to be well intentioned with who you pick. I don't know, Mike, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, there's two edges of the sword here, right? In one aspect, if you have a letter from somebody that's writing 50 people letters, when you see those 50 applications, you're going to be able to tease through kind of their thoughts and their rankings of those 50 people. But oftentimes, what's being kind of alluded to here is that person is not going to be able to kind of give you a very, very specific thoughts and a very personal experience with that person, which for me means a little bit more when I review the applications, knowing that this person has really spent a lot of time with them. But you have to think about it. When somebody writes a letter and they say, this is the best student I've ever worked with. Well, that's great if they've only worked with like 5 students, but if you have somebody else that comes and says, this is the best student I've ever worked with, but they've been doing it for 20 years and they work with 300 students, then that means a lot more. So there's two edges to the sword there. And I think a combination of both of those is the best probably combination.
Yeah. I don't think it's controversial. And it crosses over from neurosurgery to orthopedics. And I think it really does probably extend into every specialty, is that if you look for who to write letters, the first person on your list ought to be someone who you've worked closely with. Ideally, there was a question in the chat about, is it reasonable to get an international faculty member sponsor a letter? If they know you and they've worked with you, then yes, because they can attest to that. If they don't, if they are not known in the US, then it's a little less than, but you got to work with who you have. And if you get a letter from somebody famous, then it's, and they have worked with you, great, then that's the goal, that's beautiful. If they're going to say the best, you're the best student. But if they don't know you and they say you're the best student, and I see a letter from the same person that says this person is the best student, it doesn't help, right? So there's an art to all this. There was a whole session about it. It's recorded, I think, but we definitely want to, just to be advocates and you get the best person to write that you can, that knows you.
And I'll say, I'll just kind of circling it back to the topic at hand, especially when you're trying to identify, hey, like I'm reapplying whatever number it might be, and I'm trying to optimize and boost my app. You want to be very thoughtful about who you're getting letters from again, right? Because was it the letter that was a problem the first time around or the second time around, right? Did that did that sink your battleship inadvertently? And even if you are doing work with someone who is well connected or really well known, that's fine if that person can really speak about, as Dr. Ivan was mentioning, speak about you personally, speak about your strengths, how you've overcome obstacles, etc. And especially as you're going through it the second, third, fourth time around, that becomes that much more critical. So the time you put in, as Sukrit, as was described with Sukrit's experience, and even with Dr. Smith's experience, as he was sharing earlier, I think it becomes really critical to understand, like, who is going to be willing to take me under their wing and really allow me to shine, right? And to really help with my battle shield, as mentioned earlier by Dr. Agarwal. So all those things are important as you're navigating this particular sort of side of the coin. And especially on the IMG side, you really need to lean in on these individuals. And that's why for those who are like, I don't want to spend 2 years or whatever, it's not even as much about it is about the research, right? I mean, that's an important demonstrating commitment to a field, but it's also about the network, and it's about the people that you're working with and their ability to see what you want to demonstrate about your strengths to them, and giving them the opportunity to also advocate for you down the line.
And I just want to add, address something from the QA as well as the text I just got about a research year being potentially, a time investment, quote unquote, a waste of a time. I think, based on what Dr. Iyer just mentioned, I did a research year as a US graduate between my third and fourth year medical school, and I can guarantee you the mentors and the mentorship I received from that research year, it was the best investment I could have made for my career. And that kind of echoes what everyone on this panel has also been saying. So regardless, if you're trying to get into a very competitive specialty, the networking and the mentorship gains you will gain from that 1 year, it's a worthwhile investment, provided you work hard and do that return on the investment in terms of publications and networking ability.
I just want to give you one quick comparison. So, for example, I was a U.S. Med student, so obviously I wasn't disadvantaged in the international realm. But even though I didn't do a research year, every year for 3 years straight, every week for 3 years straight, I went to my mentor's lab meeting. So every single week for 3 years straight, I went to my lab meeting until I was finally not able to because of clinical rotations. So while I didn't do a research year, I spent that time building connections. So if you don't have that opportunity and you haven't built that connection, then maybe you want to build that connection during a research year. So I just want to give you that quick parallel. So when somebody says a research year is a waste of time, it's not that 1 year time that you should be thinking about. It's other people have spent 3 years time building connections where you haven't had a chance to.
With that, I'd like to transition to our next session. Thank you all for being such wonderful panelists. This session was very productive discussion. We'll be taking a short 5-minute break to catch up on the Q&A and introduce our next session of panelists. I'd like to thank everyone for such a wonderful discussion. Thank you again.
Dr. Fiki, Dr. McDaniel, Dr. Smith, Dr. Marash, Dr. Agarwal, Dr. Ivan, and Dr. Suresh. Thanks, the other Dr. Suresh. Thanks for, again, the two are not related. Thanks for taking the time to join us. We really appreciate your insight. Look forward to seeing you at the next one. Thanks. How are you, sir?
Hello.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
If anyone has questions while we're waiting for our next session, feel free to put them in the Q&A and I'll kind of get to them before we get going with our next one. So the question is, do you think that because research here is becoming increasingly popular, that the match will be saturated with these candidates and everyone will be doing research years, necessary or not? Yeah, it's a good question. I would say that that's probably it's probably trending towards that to some degree, in part because, and we're seeing it across multiple disciplines, not just in orthopedics, but part of it is really, part of it is because as step one has gone to pass fail, as grades at many institutions have gone to pass fail, and I'm sure many of you have heard me say that a few times, and applicants are figuring out more and more strategic ways to get their step two scores higher and higher than ever before, then I definitely think it's they're looking at all facets of the application, and and so the research can be helpful to that, tantamount to your commitment to a given field, whatever that might be. And it's beyond that of the actual research. It's about the networking, the mentorship, etc. But yeah, there's probably a trend towards that. And many may feel that it's necessary because of data put out by NRMP about the number of publications that are average to match, or experiences that are average to match for research. But again, I hope that what people take away from a lot of our conversations and discussions up until now is that it needs to be very individualized. And it needs to be a conversation you have with your faculty advisors and mentors, ideally, to gauge whether it's something that is valuable for you, and in the context of your application, where you're coming from, especially if you're an FMG or IMG. And those are important considerations as a whole. So do I think that a lot of people or most people will consider it? Yes. My hope is that people would do it after having a conversation introspectively, but then also with their own, their home school or home institutions personnel about what the value add that it provides. But certainly, if you're interested in academics and a career in academic medicine, irrespective of specialty, a researcher can be beneficial to kind of give you a leg up in a lot of ways. Another question that's come up is just the supplemental app is the most, most impactful experience. As a reapplicant, should we talk about not matching in this section or touch on in the personal statement? As someone who did not match, I did not really bring that up in my personal statement. And that's just like kind of a personal decision. It did come up in my interviews, and I had thought about my answers very articulately about what I wanted to say. I don't think you necessarily need to bring it up unless you think it's important to speak about how it's reinforced your commitment, how you are using it as fuel for the application cycle the next time around, or how it's driven some of your journey and decision making along the way. I would look at it. If you're going to discuss it, I would frame it in that context. But no, I do not think it's absolutely necessary to include it. But again, this is just one person's thoughts, and keep that in mind. Say that. With regards to the signaling piece, we'll answer that question in the signaling during our session that's coming up. Then there was one recent study survey of orthopedics of the interpretation of research year in reviewing applicants. And one commented that he or she viewed it negatively, essentially saying that if someone needs a researcher to do research, they will not be able to manage the rigor of residency and practice. How common is this sentiment? Honestly, that's not sure where exactly that's coming from. It's obviously one perspective, but I will say personally, the research year is, having done one, And having gone through residency, I can then, having, as we saw in the last panel, multiple people who've done research years, and obviously going through residency, I can safely tell you that I don't think it's the kind of, it's probably not the unanimous thought by any stretch. And while others may feel that way, certainly a research year affords a lot of other benefits between just that of research. But you can certainly revert back to the research section and research discussion when the recording comes out. But with that in mind, we'll kick off our next session here.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us for that break. The next session is entitled, How Do I Approach the Signaling Situation This Year? And we're extremely fortunate to have two extremely well-renowned panelists for this. Dr. Trent Guthrie, who is the program director at Henry Ford Health System, as well as AOA core signaling member who's involved directly with the signaling initiative. And Dr. Amitabh Iyer, as all of you are aware, chief of foot and ankle at Johns Hopkins and very close mentor of mine. Thank you both for joining this panel and leading this discussion. Dr. Guthrie, I'd like to start with you, sir. For the uninitiated, can you just briefly explain what signaling is, just to all our attendees so they can get caught up to speed?
Sure. First, I want to thank everybody for inviting me here. It's my pleasure to help spread the good word on signaling. What is signaling? Well, I think it's something that came out of the economics field about 20 years ago, trying to make a better match between people graduating from PhD economics programs and their jobs. And this is something that's been now applied into the residency match in a couple different specialties. Otolaryngology has done it for 2 years now. And just last year, the AAMC, through the supplemental application in ERIS, added preference signaling for 3 specialties. Now, what it is you're giving applicants the ability to have tokens, if you will, to send to programs and say that you are my top X number of programs. This is the analogous sending a rose that Dr. Bernstein talked about from the Bachelor series. Some of you may be familiar. And I think that when we look at how are we going to apply this in orthopedics, we took a step back and thought about, well, the problem that we see and the problem we're trying to solve is that inherently when everyone applies to every program, there's no value in that application. Programs are getting inundated by a lot of applications. Applicants are sending applications to everywhere at significant cost, even to places where they may not really have all that much interest. And so we approached it by saying, well, how can we add value to all parties involved? How can we make your application more meaningful when it comes to us? And how can we look at an application and say, well, this is somebody who really wants to come here. I'm going to spend extra time to do a real deep dive into this application and make sure that I have a good understanding of who this person is. And so, over time, there were a lot of discussions about how many signals. That's something that always comes up. And we are a bit of an outlier in this for a number of reasons. When you look at what's happened before, all of the other programs that have signaled in the past couple of cycles used 5 signals or 5 tokens. And when you look, the vast majority of those tokens went to the top programs. If you look at the actual numbers, it's pretty consistent across all specialties. About 50% of all signals went to 25% of programs. And to us, if we go back to that core value of adding value to this equation, there's no value there because all the top programs are getting nothing but signals and the bottom programs aren't getting any signals, and the value in that token is lost. So in order to do that, we thought we had to add more tokens to the system. And we came up with 30 at the end as a way to say, okay, how can we make sure that applicants will have the ability to select enough programs that they have an interest in. We wanted to make sure that all programs were getting a good number of signals. And another question that always comes up is, what about home programs and away rotations, and what do I do with those signals? We had that as part of our conversation too, and came up with, well, if those are included, we should make sure that we have enough signals provided for those applicants. So the consistent message we've had, you can look on the AAMC website, you can look on the CORD website. You should signal every program that you have an interest in, whether it was your home rotation or whether that was one of your away rotations. You should be spending a signal on those programs. We wanted to give applicants the ability to say, well, I went to this community program and I found it wasn't for me. I really want a big university program. And so why should they send a signal to that program if they're not really interested in doing it? So again, we wanted that latitude for the applicants. So again, the message should be loud and clear. If you're interested in a program, you should send them a signal, whether you rotate it or not.
This is Dr. Gatu. Thank you so much for being here, and for all the work that you and the core work group have been doing. It's a challenging thing because, of course, the 30 is a lot, and we've seen the numbers growing, and from your town hall a couple months ago now, or several weeks ago, there obviously the costs of applying are going up tremendously. And those are, so how do we best, so I'll kind of ask this as a two-part question. How do we best guide the students to sort of select someone who works intimately with many of them? How do I guide students to say, hey, if these are the 30 you ought to pick? And then secondly, how do we minimize kind of the overlap piece, at least in your mind, so that we don't have like 10 students signaling to the same institution? And then finally, and this has come up even, over the last 2 days, should students basically restrict their application numbers to just 30? Because with an assumption inadvertently, that programs may not be interviewing them if they're not being signaled. So kind of a three-part question, if you will.
All right, you're gonna have to remind me. I'll answer one and then you'll have to remind me the others. So the first, the last question first, and I'm gonna reword it. Is this a de facto application cap? I don't know. I think that it certainly is not really intended to do that. I think, again, going back to the fact that we're trying to add value to that application and to that signal. As a program director, I can tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to look at everybody who signaled me, and I'm going to look at them very closely. After that, I'm going to do like I do every year and look at every single application. Now, I know I'm a unicorn. I know that a lot of program directors don't look at every application, but I do. Now, to be honest, I don't spend the same amount of time with every single application because you just physically can't. But signal or no signal, I'm going to still look at every application this year. Now, I'm going to look really closely at the signals. I think that most of my interviews are going to be from people who signaled me. And I think that's probably going to be pretty consistent across the vast majority of programs. But maybe not the very top programs. I can't, I'm not sure. But again, I'm one program director. I can tell you what I'm going to do. That's about it. If I were a student or applicant going into the cycle this year, I would not apply to 30 if I were going to otherwise apply to 80 to 100 programs. Now, do I need to apply to 80 or 100 programs? Probably not. I hope not. But I don't want someone to not match just because they only applied to 30 programs. This is new. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know how it's going to work out. And I really want to stress to everybody, this is in a pilot. This is, new territory, and we don't know exactly what's going to go on. I would not add too much risk to that equation this year. All right. Did that sufficiently answer the last question?
Yeah, it does. And I think, and one thing that I want to sort of highlight, that what Dr. Guthrie is saying, there's still a lot of unknown here, right? There's still, how programs, at Henry Ford, they may be interpreting the signal one way, other programs may be interpreting in another way. But suffice to say that the signal is a way for students to sort of through ERAS indicate, hey, where they may have, particular interest. Whether it acts as a, as Dr. Guthrie said, de facto application, cap or not, it's a different story, but certainly maybe something that occurs over time should the signaling process stay. But is it something that even I might suggest to students, oh yeah, just apply to 30? Very rarely would I encourage that. And it really, your application numbers ought to be in part dependent on number of kids applying from your school and where you sort of stand relative to them. I do think that there's value in trying to, in the same way that programs with multiple students coordinate their away rotations, kind of coordinate kind of the distribution of the signals ideally. That may not happen everywhere, but if it can happen, it's probably better for the places that have multiple students over 5 applying. So that, because really, actually over 3, I would say, because most programs will not interview more than 3 students from a given place in general. Again, specialty specific, but at least in orthopedics, that's the case. So I'm actually going to, so interestingly, Dr. Guthrie, Krishna and I just came out with Dr. LaPorte as the senior author, just had a paper on signaling that got published, and kind of having done a survey of program directors. Krishna, can you kind of share a little bit of some of the results that came out of that, just so people can at least know from the orthopedic side, some of the things that were being mentioned, some of the kind of key findings, if you will?
Definitely. So, Dr. Guthrie, just to summarize, you hit the nail on the head, sir. This is unknown. And the purpose of this study was to essentially get a survey of program directors across the country to get their perspective on how important the relative weight of signaling would have compared to more traditional markers of applicant favorability, like step 1 score, step 2 score, sub-I performance, letter of recommendation, the whole gambit, if you will. And essentially across the survey, the main result was actually very interesting, that program directors actually valued signaling very highly. So signaling, although valued less than sub-I performance or personal knowledge of the applicant, was valued greater in some situations than step 2, and even in some situations, the letter recommendation. So it ranked number 3 in the level of relative weight of importance. So obviously this is a preliminary program director survey opinion study, and obviously we'll need a retrospective analysis of this once we have the data after NRMP from this upcoming cycle. But Dr. Iyer and I really thought these results were interesting on how much weight was placed on signaling. And it really emphasizes the importance that applicants this year should spend the time in carefully thinking about which programs they're signaling, because that decision is very, very important and is very, very looked highly upon by program directors, leadership in each respective program. Any thoughts on those results, sir, that that you would like to comment on?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And thank you guys for looking into this. Certainly Cord is working on a research strategy to study this before, during, and after as we move along, so that we can see just how do we do, right? But I think that it's also important to have independent voices out there too, looking into this. And I would say 2 things. One is that that really echoes the postdoc data that the other specialties have really looked at, that program directors and applicants both liked the signaling process. It was 70 to 80% in all groups and all specialties looked favorably on it and would recommend continuing it. So that's not a surprise to me that orthopedic program directors would value that highly as well. The other thought is, I think that in decision making, we need to be a little bit more specific about what kind of decision making, because it's a different process deciding who you're going to invite for interviews and where you're going to put them on the rank list. My own opinion is that I think signaling adds value to who you're going to invite for interviews. But once once they're in your door and you've interviewed them, I don't think the signaling really should matter unless you have the hubris of going around to meetings and telling people I only went to number 8 on my list to fill my, and I don't personally play those games. I think that my goal is to get the best people I can into my program, and I don't care how low on my list I go. But the job is on me then to pick the right people to come in to interview, and that's where I think that signaling will have some benefit for both sides.
I think that's a wonderful point, and we and it's really cool to be able to share, and it's an honor for us to be able to share some of that those findings with you, and you're absolutely right. I don't, I've thought about this also, like, hey, when it comes to match time, am I going to care whether they signaled or not? You know, maybe a small part of me might, but I think, as we share with students, right? Like once you get your foot in the door in your interview, it's pretty much everything's leveled out, right? So now it's about how you interview, how you present yourself. And I would say, well, hey, if this is sort of like a part of the paper application, if you will, to try to get you in, it's like a knock on the door, but you're already in there. Like, why is, you don't really need a knock anymore per se. And I think that I would agree with that I don't think it should influence the rank, but I can imagine that at some places it might, right? Just depending on how it influences things. But I don't think it would necessarily make as, I think it might add extra variability to it beyond what's already a complicated decision of trying to say, who should we rank and where? And especially, and as for students to know, I mean, at least a number of applications that we're receiving, like it's an insane amount that's coming through. And if I'm quoting Dr. Guthrie's presentation right, I mean, for ortho alone, okay, for orthopedics alone, $3 million were spent in applications this past year. $3 million. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of Taco Bell. If you're like me, it's a lot of bean burritos if you like bean burritos. But the point I'm getting at is that really the process, I mean, we're talking about inflation now, right? Like, is a big issue like across the country. And it may even go further up because of some of these unknowns that are being introduced, including signaling. So trying to be as strategic about it and trying to be with this process and the utility of the signals, I think is something that's that much more important. So, Dr. Guthrie, I'll ask you this question. How are you at Henry Ford? I don't know how many students y'all have applying, out of the associated medical schools, but, how would you suggest that either PDs or folks who are advising students, how would you say they ought to like kind of coordinate the use of the signal, especially if they have more than a handful of students applying?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't really know the answer to that, but I think you mentioned earlier a little bit, you don't want everybody signaling the same 30 programs from one school, because again, not to harp on the concept, but as a program director, there's no value there. If I look at, if I have 15 students all from Johns Hopkins and they all signal me, then I have to fall back on everything else that I traditionally did. And the struggles there. And at some point, there are places for good quality applicants. I think the problem is getting everybody to the right place. There's so much noise in the system now that I think that we're not really accomplishing that the way that we could. So what do we do from a process standpoint? And we've had some conversations about sitting down and having like a fantasy football kind of draft, and everybody can pick, well, my top is Hopkins, and then we go to the next person, and their top is Harvard, and we go to the next, and on and on and on. I don't know that it has to be as prescriptive as that, but I do think that, if you think about the concept of the prisoner's dilemma, which we've talked about at some of these sessions before, it's a game theory concept that everybody working in isolation ends up with a worse outcome than they could working together. I think that if we can work together at the each institution level, each medical school level, all of the students can end up with a better match than if everybody is fighting against each other. And so I do think some coordination is valuable. Now, what does that look like? I don't know. And again, I don't want to get too far involved with that process just because of my obvious conflict of interest. But I do think that, again, students would be wise to work together.
Those are great questions, and I think what we'll now do, great sentiments, and we really, this is so invaluable for everybody. And this is, again, irrespective of whether you're doing ortho or not, for the record, because again, other specialties, and I've sent in some links that say who's using the signals this year, number of tokens, et cetera. So kind of take what we're saying, obviously it's applicable to ortho, but it is, translates to other specialties too. So we'll kind of start our Q&A now. We'll do that for a few minutes. And so we see one person who's raised their hand. We will allow them to ask their question. And then when they're done, others can go ahead and raise their hand, and we can kind of let people ask directly as well. So Hallie, go for it.
Dr. Iyer, in the meantime, I got a question on Instagram.
Okay.
From a medical student perspective, how can we coordinate with our classmates to minimize signaling overlap? Are there any strategies the panelists would recommend?
Yeah, so we just talked about that a little bit. I think the one strategy we talked about was having a bit of a lottery or getting together as a group and strategizing so that you're not all sending signals to the same places. I think that 3 is a good number. Dr. Iyer put that out there. I think a lot more than that, and it gets watered down a bit. Now, I don't think it should be an absolute number. Obviously, if you're coming from as an example, Wayne State, we're going to get a lot of signals coming to Henry Ford because we're 2 miles away. So I think that's going to be a little bit different, a little bit nuanced, depending on your individual schools as well, depending on how many students you have and how competitive a school it is and things like that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it does help. I think it's harder for students, I think, because there's so much anxiety to try to coordinate amongst themselves, because I feel that, it's like, hey, it's the prisoner's dilemma, as Dr. Guthrie mentioned earlier. And, it's like, hey, should I help someone for the greater good, or is it about kind of myself as an individual? And that's a different conversation. But suffice to say, I think if you can coordinate amongst yourselves, great. But it's probably even better and more powerful if you have a faculty member, whether it's the PD, associate PD, the interest group liaison or faculty liaison, or a dean's office, advising individual who can try to help with this. I think that's probably the most powerful, because then he or she is going to have everyone's best interest, and no one has to feel like they're, being put out inadvertently. But I think that that's an important thing, and doing it in the context of, not just where you're doing your ways, but also in the context of the strength of your application. I think that's very valuable too.
Yeah, if I could just jump in for a second, I think one topic or a question that was asked earlier that I never got around to is the importance of faculty advisors and mentors really working through that list, and what does your 30 look like? I think that's going to be different for everyone. I had brought up this concept at the webinar before about the REACH programs, the kind of wheelhouse programs, and the safety schools, and how do you work your signals in order to match your application? If you are the top student at Hopkins, you're going to be able to come out and have 25 REACH schools, if you will, and 5 kind of wheelhouse schools, and you may not even need to worry about the safety schools. If you're kind of lower to the middle class at another school, you may want to consider, hey, I need to have a 10-10-10 strategy. Or if you're really weak, you may want like a 5-5-20 strategy or something like that. But this is where it really gets important, because students don't know, well, where should I be applying? And that's where the advisors can really jump in and help them to make that list. Whereas before, our role was, I don't know, apply to 80 or 100 programs and you'll be fine. But now if we get into the weeds and say, all right, well, let me see your application. Okay, that's a pretty solid application. Let's kind of have a good mix, or just as an example. And I think that so it's hard to really say how unless you get in and look at the application and know where they're coming from and what are their goals and those sorts of things.
There's a really interesting, thank you so much for that insight, Dr. Guthrie. There's a really interesting chat about question about couples matching in the Q&A. If you are couples matching into a competitive specialty, right, what is your recommendation on overlapping signals with your significant other? Should you be sending signals to the same exact set of 30 programs? How do you consider relative competitiveness of each specialty that each individual is matching into? Any thoughts on that, sir?
I don't know. I'm sure there's some mathematician out there who could do it better than I could, but I think that it shouldn't be that foreign to us, to be able to pick the top X number. And if we're going to say 30, or if we're going to say 80, or if we're going to say 150, it doesn't matter. And so I think at the end of the day, you need to, with your couples match partner, get in there and say, all right, where are the top places we want to go? And historically, the strategy is pick larger areas like Southeast Michigan, where you can go to DMC and Ford and U of M and Beaumont. And, if there are places that have several programs, those are really attractive to couples applicants. And I think this will actually help them. If you look at some of the data from other specialties, the couples matches felt like they were actually helped by the signaling process. It conceptually gets a little more complicated, and I think there is a way to really work it. But another kind of related thing is, what if you're dual applying? How do you work that? Through ERIS, if you're dual applying, you'll get 30 signals here, and you can get however many signals in general surgery and however many signals in so you can stack them that way, and they're completely separate until you get down to your match list at the end. But in terms of your application, it is additive.
Yeah, I 1000% agree with that. And I think, again, there's a lot of what we're sharing is a little bit speculative because it's still the first time we're using it. So I just want to make that very clear. Someone asked, we're gonna get through a couple more of these questions, and then we transition to the next session. Someone asked about using all 30 signals. I would definitely encourage that. Dr. Guthrie, would you encourage that as well?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
There's no reason not to.
If there is, a couple of people are asking about kind of regional strategies. Like if you said my geographic preference is one area, but I'm signaling outside of that, you certainly can. I don't know if the programs will know one way or the other. They do the programs, as far as you're aware, do you know if the programs are notified about, they're probably notified about preferences, but I don't, are they notified about preferences in terms of what you suggested? Or what they've indicated, if you will?
So there are three parts to the ERIS supplemental application. The first part is the preference signaling, and that's just the 1 through 30. And they're all equal weighted. So number 30, we won't be able to see I was number 6 on your list. It'll just say that you signaled me. The second part is your past experiences section, where you'll have a little narrative, a blurb on some things that are meaningful to you. And the third part is geographic signaling. And honestly, I don't know what to do about that, because there are a couple of ways to do it. One is you will have the ability to pick several geographic regions, and it's based on the, I want to say 18 different US Census zones. The other way is to say, I have no preference. And honestly, I think that in working, kind of gaming through in orthopedics specifically, when you have 30 signals, I think it makes most sense. And what I'm advising is to do, say no preference, because that's another way that you may get excluded. If you applied to all California programs and Henry Ford and Detroit, and I see that you didn't signal me, I might still look at your application, like I said earlier. But if you'd said geographically you're only going to go West Coast, and I see that you didn't signal anything in the Midwest or the East Coast, that's a couple strikes against you. And I may get the sense that you really don't want to come to the Midwest, which is fine. That's totally up to you. But so I think that the best strategy, given the fact that you have the 30 signals and you can, in a sense, geographically signal within those 30, would be to say no preference. Now that's different in other specialties that only have 5 signals, and that you may be able to use that geographic signaling to broaden your reach, if you will, and have a little bit more signal to your application.
Awesome. I think that is all wonderful information, Dr. Guthrie. We want to thank you so very much for being here today. We're going to make our way to our next session. Thank you again for providing such insight into an already kind of tumultuous process. Thank you hope you have a great day, and please feel free to stay on and join us in any of our other panels if you would like.
Thanks for having me, and please feel free to reach out to me directly. I know Dr. Iyer has my information to anybody that has any questions.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thanks.
Alrighty, are we still going to wait 5 minutes for the next session?
We can wait like a couple minutes while I move the panelists back into the main webinar. Thanks so much, Asil.
You're welcome.
There's a question in the Q&A. It says, do you not advise signaling your school program or research your program and save it for another program? By de facto, your home program will already know that you're interested in it. I think this is an important question you should be having with your leadership at your specific research program and your home program, because I've heard answers both ways based on the study that Dr. Iyer and I did. Some program directors obviously know you're interested in the program and would recommend you using that signal elsewhere, and that's not going to be weighed against you. But at the same time, other program directors and leadership of the program want you to still send a signal to them. So this is a very important conversation you should be having with the leadership in your home or research institution. Thank you so much for asking that. I think with that, we are ready to start the next session. Asil, please take it away.
Awesome. Hey guys, so I'm Asil. I'm one of the interns at Carolinas Medical Center right now. Thank you for having me. And in this session, we're going to be talking about how to address a weakness in your applications. So just wanted to welcome you all. Thank you for taking time out of your Sunday to be here. And also thank you to all of our panelists for being here as well. On this panel, we have Dr. Nitin Agarwal, who is a neurosurgery attending at Washington University, St. Louis, Dr. James Fickey, orthopedic chair at Johns Hopkins, and Dr. Michael Ivan, who is Department of Neurosurgery at the University of Miami, and also Claire McDaniel. She's one of the residents at Hopkins. Nice to have you all. If you all want to give a brief little introduction.
Okay, so Asil, nice to see you again. It's great. I hope Dr. Shu and the Carolinas group are treating you well. I've been a chair at Hopkins for going on my 10th year now, and prior to that, I was 30 years in the military. And I was involved with residency education there for over 20 years. The points relevant to this are that I didn't get into my first choice. I didn't get into residency first year out. It was required in the military to do a gap year, if you will call it that. But just in terms of mentoring and guiding as a chair, I work our entire program. All of our faculty are involved in the residency interviews and the ranking and selection process for that. So my perspective as an orthopedic educator is what I think I was asked to be here for. Glad to be on the panel.
Thank you.
Hi, Mike Ivan, one of the neurosurgeons at University of Miami. I've been down there for 7 years now. I have a large role in the residency application process, as well as I'm the directorship of one of our fellowships. But I think what I bring to the table is that, I had a kind of a not usual method of getting into medical school. It was challenging. I took many years off, and then got into medical school, and then really matched up to from a low medical school to like a really high residency program, and bring kind of the values that I've learned across the way in kind of that experience. And I've also been really integral in kind of this approach to mentoring students and residents to get into neurosurgery now for the last 7 years, by starting our own courses in the neurosurgery kind of conferences and meetings, really focused on medical students and mentoring.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Nitin Agrawal. I'm attending at WashU. I actually went to the same med school that Dr. Ivan went to, and similarly had a chance to go to a really high-powered residency and then fellowship, and then land a dream job. So I think a lot of us in the panel had struggles early on that we were able to overcome, and hopefully you can learn from those struggles and have a similar success.
And Nitin's being modest because he's also the author of a new book called Surviving Neurosurgery that is focused on everything you need to know about how to get into neurosurgery, be a good resident, be productive, and start your career. So congrats to him on that.
Thank you.
And hi, everybody. I'm Claire. I'm a clinical PGY3. I just finished a research year here at Hopkins. I took a traditional route through to med school, but then I did an MBA in the middle of my medical school training. So I come from a background on kind of interview coaching and job prep that I think can be kind of useful in the healthcare field, because it's something that we don't have a ton of experience of in medicine, that we're not really taught. I also come from a medical school that had a lot of people applying into specifically orthopedics, and had a very formalized mentorship and specifically clinical work model to make sure that we were the best prepared to become good applicants. And I think there are a few pearls from that process that I'd like to share here.
Awesome. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with some questions. People, please free to use the Q&A for any other questions as this seminar goes on. So just first and foremost, red flags or weaknesses in an application can be defined in many different ways, and whether or not something's actual weakness is an argument for each their own, but it can actually be used as a strength. So just to kind of discuss, where is the most appropriate way in your definitions, and anybody can answer this question, where should someone address a weakness that's in their application, and where should that be done? Should it be done in a personal statement during the interview cycle? Should it be reached out beforehand and mention it?
Dr. Figge, why don't we have you go first?
Okay. Asila, this group, I will say, is a humble group of experts, and so it's all of us we'll wait for your guidance to tell us who. But since Dr. Iyer has thrown me out there, I will take this on. First, I don't know what the best way is. And to be candid about this, if you put it in your personal statement, then it will be discussed in every interview. If you put it in your personal statement as a teaser, not an elaboration, to use those very precious 500 words, I think it's not unreasonable to say something about your relative paucity of research because you didn't have an opportunity. But I think that's the hardest place to do it well. I think that it's going to show up in your RS packet, and so if you bring it out in an interview first, if you bring it out as part of your lead-in on your interview, then you have a chance to manage that. And I think that's an area where one, you run if it depends on the gradation of weakness, and you just really hit it on the head. I think that red flags are ones that are probably potentially disqualifying. So, for instance, on ARS packet, there's a check mark of whether you've ever had a felony. That's a red flag. I think that if you've had a felony, you probably better say something in your personal statement, or you probably won't get an interview in many places. But if you've failed a rotation, then that's a red flag that you want to, because that gets you your foot in the door for the interview. If you're able to take a relative weakness and discuss it in your interview, I would do that. I think that's my perspective, but there's no book on this unless Dr. Agarwal has it in his book. But I think that it really is important to say, what are the grades of red flags? Probably need to say something or you won't get an interview. Strong weaknesses, weak weaknesses, low weaknesses are, probably touch that in your personal statement. Otherwise, a teaser or nothing, and then be prepared to lean in with your interview questions.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that if you have a good story and reasoning behind the weakness, then the personal statement is a good way to do it. I think even before that, if you back up though, is just, how do you even get that first residency invite? Because, certain programs they have cutoffs and they have number requirements. And, when they're getting thousands of applications, it is just the easiest way to kind of do the initial sort. And some people are really strict with them and some people aren't. So even before that, I mean, it's having your mentor, having your connections kind of reach out and be like, hey, I know this person has a low board score, but they really were impressive on this, and this, like really make sure you try to take a close look at them. And then, once you get to the personal statement, then, if it's a glaring weakness that you have a good story to go, like, for instance, we had somebody, I think it was last year, a couple of years ago, was from Iraq. She had low board scores, but she had fought, like she was fighting in the Iraqi, military at the time of taking her boards and working as like a physician in the front line of, something that's really like an obvious kind of like, well, I took my boards while I was like on the front line here. And that's kind of like a really good story to kind of make sure you bring out in your application that really you can't bring out anywhere else, right? Like, where else are you going to put that on your application than in the personal statement, right? Other people who are like, we have some people who are Olympic athletes or NFLs. I mean, that's going to be obviously somewhere else in the application process, and you don't necessarily need to rewrite about that in the personal statement because it's going to come out on your activities and all that kind of stuff. But, and then if something comes, and then when you get to your interview is the third time you get to address it, and you got to know that the question is going to come up, and you got to be really, really sharp and succinct with what you've learned from it, how you've overcome it, how you won't let it happen again, or how it made you stronger. You got to turn that weakness into a strength somehow, and really kind of show and convince that this is just a blip in the past, and that you are 10 times stronger because of it.
I think one of the sleek ways I've seen this done is it's incumbent on you having a really good mentor. But if you have a really good mentor, you put in that work to get a good mentor. The mentor addresses it up front for you in their letter of rec. So that way, they're saying there's this deficiency, but here's why they're amazing. That is, especially if you get that from somebody who is, well recognized or well regarded, or, knows that people know that these letters mean something from that person. I think that can actually end up being an advantage, because one of the things we're always looking for is grit and resiliency. And if you've had a shortcoming and now you've overcome it, to me, that's even more valuable than somebody who's had no shortcomings. So it always ties back into that theme of, doing the work up front to get somebody to vouch for you.
I agree. Very well said. Thank you for your answers. I have a question that came up in the Q&A. How do you address the reason behind a failure and properly attribute or emphasize its significance without necessarily blaming it or putting it off as not our fault? Claire, do you want to take this?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question. And it comes down to the amount, you have to do a good amount of introspection and understanding of your application as a whole. What is this weakness? Why is it a weakness for you? And then you have to, take into account what was happening in your life, what was happening in your studies and things like that. You don't want to dismiss it. It is a truth on the application. It's a number of publications. It's an objective fact. but you have to be understanding, acknowledging, and moving forward in a positive, optimistic way. I do think that you need to take the time to think about it, maybe even write down reasons why it was happening. Talk about it with your mentors, talk about it with your peers. Was it something, a motivation, a barrier, something? And talk about ways that that issue and why it arose won't arise in the future, or what you are doing to address it. You can't be dismissive, but you can't perseverate on why it happened. You can just look to the future.
And just wanted to touch base, like expand a little bit upon that. I think Dr. Fiki on yesterday's session, the letter recommendation session, made a statement that the prose, the language you use, or your letter writer or your mentor uses, is very important. This is a discussion that you have to have with your mentor, how they can address it or help you address it in their letter when, when all these programs are going to see what your mentor thinks about you. If you have a glaring weakness, I think it's important for you to address it in a very careful and well thought out way. But it's also important for your mentor to address that weakness in your letter as well. And this was a very important point brought up by Dr. Fiki in the letter recommendation session yesterday.
Thanks, Krishna. So that really dovetails. I think Dr. Ivan mentioned this. Your letter writer. I don't know if I'm given the right. I don't know if it may have been Dr. Agarwal, but so one of the neurosurgeons that are gracing us said your letter writer has the sanguinity to, that's my word, but it has the way that they can word this in a way that is independent of you, but is addressing it. And that, I think, is much better. I think in terms of communication, verbal communication is always the least misunderstood, most effective way to get through something that's controversial. Emails are they're more often misunderstood, and texts are terrible. So if you have a personal statement and you write something that is sort of a flagging, it's going to be it's going to be easy for people to misunderstand that. But in a letter writer, they can actually go into this independent of you in some ways. And so bring that up with your mentor and the people who are, or a person who's writing your letter, because if they don't, and that's what Krishna highlighted is, as a letter writer, I will ask them, what's your story? I will kind of test them, as Claire has mentioned several times, to test them to be able to articulate that verbally in their interview. And then I can actually describe some of that as a letter writer. So I think those are good techniques for sort of the getting it across, but not making excuses.
It can be very hard. All the sentiments thus far are super important, and I'm learning a lot myself. And I will say that it can be very difficult to share, whether it's with a peer, a faculty member who might be writing a letter, and be vulnerable about situations that you feel scathed from. But it's also very important to be transparent. So that way, when your letter writer is trying to advocate for you, and there's something that's sort of discrepant between, hey, something on the application has come up, and the letter writer is known by the people reviewing the app, and they can say, hey, what is this person like? There's not a discordance, because that can really hinder your ability to succeed. So while it may be a tough conversation, it ends up being easier than you realize. And I think at the end of the day, the people who are going to write letters for you, or who are going to support you, sponsor you, mentor you, they're going to be that much more thoughtful. How do we help you move through this? And even when I was, and I'll use myself as an example. It was towards the tail end of my recruitment to Hopkins, and Dr. Fiki and I had to share with him some stuff that I had dealt with. And it was definitely not something that I wanted to share, but I had to share it because it was important to do so. And we talked through it, and he was so respectful of my voicing of what had transpired and the situations I had been in. And in some ways, I actually commend you and appreciate you take, grace, kind of in sharing this with me in this vulnerable way. So I think that you can actually gain a lot more and actually strengthen your relationship with the individual writing this letter if you are honest with them from the jump, right? Or as early as you can be. And I think that's something I just really want to highlight as someone who's kind of dealt with it myself personally too, with weaknesses, if you will, as far as an application is concerned.
Okay, next question. How can advocacy play a role in addressing weaknesses? So as students, obviously we can advocate for ourselves, but also how can the role of a mentor really take a role and play in making sure weaknesses are addressed appropriately? Let's go with Dr. Ivan, if you want to take this one.
Yeah, sure. So, when you're trying to address a weakness, you're trying to build up foundation walls of all the good things that kind of overshadow the weakness. How you responded from the weakness. Is it maybe you were late to deciding ortho or neurosurgery and you don't have a lot of research? So, a mentor could say, well, he did great work before this. He just made this transition. He's already working with 2 people in the research area, and I know he's got several publications coming out. And hearing that from a second perspective is much more powerful than the student saying it themselves. Same thing with grades, saying, listen, I know that person has a low board score, but I've worked with them clinically in rotations for the last 2 years on the floor. He's answered every question correctly. He has great common sense, great insight. And these are the intangibles that coming from a second perspective is key. And, and somebody who I know in the field reaches out to me or makes a phone call, makes an email and says, hey, I know this application is coming in. This is the apparent weakness, but here are my opinion as to why I think that that's less important than it looks like on paper. Please take a second look. And having a mentor that's going to be able to do that for you in the appropriate way is definitely hard to know how to pick that, but it definitely should be something you could ask once you get to kind of build that relationship with somebody and be like, hey, you can't send it out to like 150 programs, that message, but you carefully select and say, hey, these are the programs that I really want a chance at. Can you please reach out to them and try to tell this story of why to kind of build up my other areas that I'm really strong in and not pay attention to the weakness.
Thank you. Anybody have any other remarks for this question, or should we move on to the next one?
I have a quick question, actually. So we talked about 2 perspectives. So right now, the perspective of, being the mentor and writing very strong letter addressing a specific individual's weakness. But all the attendings on this call, all of you read thousands of letter recommendations, have extremely good insight into what common weaknesses are in applications and how they're addressed. Taking that perspective, can Dr. Fiki, Dr. Ivan, Dr. Agarwal, can you guys give me an example of when you saw a weakness, a glaring weakness that was addressed very well by a specific letter writer or specific individual that led to a successful outcome? Because I feel like having a concrete example from each of you will really help our panelists understand what goal they should aspire for when addressing a specific weakness.
Yeah, I think the weakness that occurred doesn't really matter as long as it's not a glaring red flag like a felony or something like that, because sometimes that's institutional cutoffs. But common ones are just common. For example, low board score. There are a lot of screenings for neurosurgery at 240, 250, even, which sounds crazy, but it's definitely 240. And when you get somebody who is well known in the field for having mentored a lot of students, who either calls or writes and says, despite this board score, this person has the grit and resilience and dedication to be a neurosurgeon. And that's all, sort of all you need to say, okay, a number is a number. But what we really want our soldiers with people with grit, people with resilience.
I like that Dr. Agarwal uses the analogy of soldiers quite a bit. I answered a written Q&A about osteopathic doctors applying for allopathic programs. And so here's one that, that I have with that specifically in the military. Osteopaths have been successful and been fantastic in training programs, of all the training programs for decades. with it. And so now they're recognizing ACGME and we're aligned in the academy, the AOS in orthopedics. But our program hasn't had an osteopath. We haven't trained one. I think that'll change with time, but I have written letters for osteopaths into civilian programs. And I've had the time I've spent time with them. I've encouraged them to be clinical, but the success of that is, let's say I don't want to say that's a weakness. It's a training form that actually is a strength. And I have had allopaths that are not hands-on, and osteopaths that have an additional tool in their armamentarium. And I tend to turn that into a strength. And so writing letters for them, we were able to have one successfully matched into a civilian program this past year that I wrote a letter for. And I did so by saying, okay, many people look at this as a weakness or haven't trained a person in this. Consider this: osteopathic manipulation technique in orthopedics is incredibly valuable. Boom. That's the example. That's the concrete. And I think take something, but again, red flag weaknesses are really challenging. And you've got to also, as an advisor, a letter writer, or a mentor, really be able to have that conversation with somebody.
And Dr. Fickey brings up a good point. For the relative weaknesses, not the red flags, but the relative weaknesses, it's important to address them, but it's also important to demonstrate on your application, in your personal statement, on your sub-Is, what have you, what are your actual strengths. So for me, I did some research, but not a ton. But I worked really hard on my clinical away rotations, and I made sure that on my rotations in medical school, I got the grades to demonstrate that across all specialties, not just surgery, even though I knew I wanted to do that. So there has to be a give and a take. You have to address what might be a weakness, but also bolster and demonstrate your strengths at the same time.
Thank you. And let's see. We have time maybe for one more question. Any ways to not address a weakness in your application? What are the don'ts that you have seen over the past few years in your reviewing of applications, and ways people can avoid making those same mistakes? We'll go with you, Dr. Agarwal.
Yeah, I think that the way that I've seen people shoot themselves in the foot is in interviews. So when you have a weakness or an issue, we want people with accountability, right? Integrity is probably, when we ask people what's the number one quality, I'm usually looking for integrity. People get various answers that are fine, but I think that if you have a fault, like I said before, the most valuable thing in any trainee or any physician is somebody who can recognize when a mistake happened, have ownership, and then improve from that. That's what you would want in your own physician. So I think when you don't, when an issue is identified and then you don't take responsibility, or it doesn't seem that you've taken responsibility, or it doesn't seem that you've improved from that mistake, that's a serious issue, because then questions come up as, is this person teachable? Is this person trainable? Does this person have accountability? And I mentioned earlier, there's these 3 A's, available, affable, and able, but I've really changed on what I said. Instead of 3 A's of available, affable, and able, it's available, affable, and accountable.
Thank you.
Yeah, just, you try not to make it sound like an excuse. It is your own it. What have you learned from it? And you're going to have, people will have that asked to them in an interview anyway. So it merits practicing. As Dr. McDaniel said, really think about it, coach it, practice, rehearse your answers, write it down, because that is going to be one of your questions. And so that can give you a lot of time in the interview where they won't ask some blind curveballs or blindside. That's coming up. So be prepared.
Thank you. So we maybe have some time for final remarks if anybody has any last minute pieces of advice. Otherwise, we'll get going to the next session so we're not too late and behind.
I'll just, in kind of anticipating the transition, I'll just say, well, first off, thanks everybody, Dr. Ivan, Dr. Agarwal, Dr. McDaniel, Dr. Fickey, thanks for being here. Thanks for providing your insight. It is, and Dr. Did, thanks for moderating. It is 1000% important. You heard a lot of different things across a lot of different perspectives. Brand new residents, seasoned residents, faculty, chair. And the key takeaway for me, and what I would share with you, is to have open, honest dialogues with the people around you that you're looking to have support you. And again, if you don't have those individuals, now is the time to make sure you start aligning yourselves with the people that can help you navigate the terrain that is showcasing, demonstrating your vulnerability, weakness in your application, what you can do to improve upon that. So don't hesitate to have those honest conversations, even if difficult at first, because they may be more fruitful in the long run.
Yeah.
So with, Dr. Fink, go for it.
I'll try to make this like 10 seconds, but it's something that I could talk about at some other time with anyone who wants to hear it. But one of my favorite lectures that I've ever given as a visiting speaker is about serendipity in second place. Dr. Sukrit Suresh mentioned the word serendipity. It's when fortunate happenstances occur when we say yes. And so to realize first that you have a weakness in your application should be a reality check to say, look at programs where that might be still attainable. And I got into my second place residency, and I was still an orthopedic surgeon. So accept that if there's a weakness that you may not be able to go to a place, but you might put that stretch, but then get some real attainable targets in your signaling and everything else that we've been talking about this weekend. So thanks for the chance to talk. This is great. Great
Thanks
session.
again.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it. We'll be transitioning to our next session momentarily.
All right, everyone, we're going to take a couple minutes between the next session. Thank you all for our panelists for joining.
Are we in the back room? Backstage?
Not quite yet. If you click on the bottom, towards the bottom right of the Zoom window, you should see the backstage option. And if you click on that, that'll take you back there.
Just 1 minute to get one more. think, Andy, we're ready to get started. Thanks so much.
All right, well, welcome everyone. My name's Andy. I'm a PGY3 orthopedics at Johns Hopkins, and this session is ways to approach your mentor to optimize advocacy during the match. I'd like to thank all the panelists for being here and for all the medical students for listening in. We'll be talking about things like, basically I wanted to separate the application and interview process chronologically and talk about ways that your mentors may be able to help you along the way. On this panel, we have Krishna, who's been here for a while, and Dr. Fiki as well, Dr. Agarwal, Dr. Ivan, and Dr. Sethupathi. Would the panelists mind introducing themselves very briefly?
Hi, everyone. I'm Krishna. I'm a first-year orthopedic, as Andy mentioned, I'm a first-year orthopedic resident at Johns Hopkins. Thank you so much for having me.
Hi, Mike Ivan, neurosurgeon at the University of Miami, attending for the last 7 years, and just a privilege to be here to talk to you guys today.
Hi, I'm Sheetal. I'm a first-year dermatology resident at St. Louis University. Thank you for having me.
And I'm Amita Bayer, orthopedic foot and ankle surgeon at Hopkins, and actually good co-residence with one of Dr. Ivan's former classmates from med school.
Nitin Agarwal, I'm one of the attendings at WashU. I don't know who's on, but I feel you guys have heard from us a bunch of times, so thanks for keep bringing us back. We appreciate it.
Great. And so I figured we'll start with, before the ERAS application is sent out, is there anyone that thinks that, it's a good idea to let certain institutions know beforehand that you plan to apply there? And, I know this is like, we're starting earliest in the application process, but is this too early to start expressing interest in programs, or should you wait? What are some people's thoughts on this?
I could take this one to start out with. That question is really interesting because I think there's no definitive, clear-cut, that standardized answer that everyone's going to give you. What I personally did was, I think I would encourage all applicants to strategize specifically, identify a specific list of institutions they're interested in and why. This shouldn't be a list of 30 programs, rather it should be a list of your top 5. Yesterday we addressed this in the how to make a rank list. People generally had an idea which programs they're interested in before the ERAS application goes out. And I wouldn't personally reach out myself as an applicant. I would go through mentors, and we have addressed this topic, mentorship, a lot in this whole boot camp. I wouldn't personally go through myself. I'd talk to Dr. Sponseller, told him what my interests were, and then he reached out on my behalf, telling these programs that I'm interested in them. Having faculty to faculty interaction, I think, is far more fruitful for the applicant compared to just the applicant themselves reaching out, cold emailing programs. I think it's much more beneficial to have faculty reach out on your behalf.
Kind of going off that. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Kind of going off that. I agree with Krishna. I think faculty to faculty communication in terms of reaching out to programs is definitely the strongest. I think I may have had a different experience because Krishna had really strong mentorship with his research PI. As I was going through the application cycle, I had great mentors, but not really someone to reach out to in terms of somebody to communicate to other programs on my behalf. That being said, that doesn't mean that just because you don't have that you cannot express interest on your own. I would agree that maybe at this stage of the application cycle, it may be too early to do that on your own. I do feel that once you send out residency applications through ERAS, if you want to express interest at that time to some of the programs that you're most interested in, that would probably be more fruitful than reaching out to them at this point in the cycle.
I think my advice with all communication to residency programs and residents is, You want to be interested, you want to show that you're committed, you want to show that you've done your research about the program, but you don't want to be annoying, right? It's a very fine line, and that's kind of goes on the sub-Is to the interview, and then all the communications before and after the interview cycle. It's it's a very fine line. It's hard to kind of gauge somebody how many times and what is the right thing to say. But I don't think it's wrong to reach out, especially if you have a connection there, and let them know that this is a program you're really looking forward to, and you really hope that they look at your application seriously. Obviously, it comes, like everybody said, if it comes from a physician or attending that's known to their program directly to them about you, that's a little bit more powerful, more likely to read that and remember it than if you just get a random email from a student, from a med student. But I definitely don't think so. I think it's probably more important if you have a very specific weakness that you want to address, or if it's a program that you really, it's like, really your top program, and that because of you've done a sub-I there, or a lot about the program. It's never too early to kind of address those things and make them and start discussing them before they kind of make the decision. Because the worst thing is that when a program makes a decision about you, it's almost impossible to change that decision. It really is. And so, being ahead a little bit, I think is better than being too late.
Thank you, Dr. Ivan. I think that's really great advice. I've heard, at least when I was going through the interview process, I heard different things or opinions about if and when your mentors may have influence on the selection process. And like I heard someone told me that, you should ask this person to reach out to you to try and get you an interview at XYZ program, or to, basically before interview invites are sent out. And I asked one of my mentors and told them I was interested in a specific program. And he said, it was his belief that if a program wasn't going to offer you an interview, then, an interview that you only got because somebody reached out to you probably isn't worthwhile. But if they do offer you an interview and then someone reaches out right before the interview, that can be a catalyst to, potentially help you out. And he basically said, I don't believe in reaching out to get interviews, but if you do get an interview somewhere, I think that could really help if I, put in a good word for you at XYZ program. Just interested to hear what people think about this. There are obviously different opinions and ways to kind of strategize this in terms of when people reach out, but does anyone have thoughts?
Yeah, I'll jump in. So I think that there's sort of three timelines. The first timeline is sort of now, pre-submission, and I usually encourage, when people ask, oh, should I reach out to a PD on social media, email, whatever. Some are obviously very responsive, some are not, or not as responsive because they're busy getting interns, acclimated. And so I usually suggest, if you're trying to reach out to a program, get to know the program a little bit more, because there's not always the most concrete information out there, reach out to the residency coordinator, because that is a very easy way to get to know the person who's the gatekeeper for the program as a whole. And you want to make nice with him or her anyway, because they really are the ones who help navigate the kind of the whole application. They steer the ship a lot of times for the whole application cycle. They can also connect you with resident and or faculty liaisons that are often either officially or unofficially designated to communicate as part of outreach. And that's sort of an easy way to, and then if the program director happens to be a part of that, okay, but you've sort of, hit, kill two birds with one stone, if you will, in terms of not only establishing connection with the residency coordinator, but now you've gotten to know some people who kind of know the program, can give you more insight. Certainly social media pages that exist and websites, now that they're probably more updated, more so now than ever before, those are also great ways to get to know programs. I would still be very thoughtful about which programs you're reaching out to because really try to tease out. I just would not email everyone, because you want to reach out just to reach out. It has to be very intentional. The second phase of it is sort of close to ERAS, and this year, which is different than prior years, ERAS and MSPE, if I'm not mistaken, are going out at the same time at the end of September. So that means that usually if you're going to have a mentor send an email out, it's probably ideal if it's as close to the time that the programs are ready to read the application. So I usually suggest to students, like I will, as soon as right before MSPs go out, which has been different than the ERAS in past years, I'll send messages to your top whatever. And so when people ask me, how many will you reach out to? I say 3. Why is it 3? Because at least in ortho, and probably similar in competitive specialties, and Dr. Ivan, Dr. Agarwal can comment on neurosurge at least, most programs will not interview more than 3 students from a given program. And so if I'm reaching out to like 5, a place for 5 students, that's like a waste of time for a couple of them. Then at the same time, as as Dr. Suresh was mentioning earlier, I encourage students themselves to reach out to, like, say 5 to 10, no more than that, right? And that's sort of like, hey, just an email to express interest. So that's sort of like a double sort of like way of waiting, especially in this year, waiting the signal to some extent. Then fast forward, and the third part is right after once you're done interviewing, and once you're done interviewing, and once you're actually on your ready to make your rank list, that's when you have your faculty advocate reach out to your number 1. So all of that being said, and to your question, Andy, in particular, I think that I think especially in talking to many PDs and whatever more recently, it can be hugely helpful. They want to know before the interviews go out, because sometimes that can be the make or break point at that time. Once, especially now, as there's with the virtual interviews and whatever else, if you've got an interview, great, but sometimes you need that extra push from someone ahead of time to get the interview in the first place, just because of how competitive it's gotten. And now with different metrics going to pass fail, that also adds an extra layer of sort of ambiguity to everything. So I think that I encourage reaching out ahead of time, as opposed to waiting till only after you get an interview. But I do think that as far as after the interviews are done and you're making rank lists, reaching out to your number 1 spot by the faculty member, that I think could be instrumental.
I would just add that there's one more time point there, which is when the faculty do the rank listing. So after the interviews, every program just has a random day that they kind of get all their faculty residents together and they do like the initial ranking of everybody. And I think, you want to have as much information forward to that program at that time period that before that rank meeting. So whether it be new publications, whether it be I've already interviewed at 20 programs and you're my top, or is it I just really love your program and I really consider this one of the best places I've been to, however we want to phrase kind of your excitement or interest in that program, to get that across to them before they have their rank meeting is also kind of a critical time point, because it's the last time point where everybody's kind of fighting for their favorite candidates and giving reason behind their candidates. And if you have somebody who's just like, oh yeah, we all like them, but we haven't heard from them, I don't even know if they're interested, versus somebody who's very similar, who said, yeah, they reached out to us, they reached out to 5 faculty, they've said all of them that they're like, this is a top choice for them and they want to come here. That does play into effect at that last meeting when you're trying to compare like the really kind of very tiny differences between applicants.
Thank you, Dr. Ivan. That's makes a lot of sense. I'm not sure if this how much this actually varies between programs, but I've heard that some programs, especially those with many interview days, have their rank meeting at the end, and maybe they have a short meeting after that specific interview day. But do you think that do you think that's something that's very prevalent, where people have a rank meeting that's maybe 2 months after your interview? And should we approach those programs differently?
I think it's a totally valid question to ask. You don't even have to ask the faculty sometimes. Sometimes you could just ask the program coordinator, the administrator, and just be like, hey, like just asking, do they have a rank meeting? Do you know approximately when it would be? You don't have to like get the time and the date kind of thing. But yeah, the program director and the chairman, are making kind of subtle changes throughout the entire length until the actual rank list is submitted. So you technically have time to kind of interact with them all the way until that last time period. But, if you want to get the most, if you've had a connection with somebody, you've done research with them, you've written a paper while you did a sub-I, or or the resident that you stayed in touch with after the interview, those are the kind of people that their influence on the match list kind of decreases as you get closer to the rank list day. And so if you want to kind of communicate with them, it's better to do it, around before they have that rank list meeting. At least that's how it is in nursery.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it sounds like, that approach could apply to any specialty. I'm interested to hear what people think about, expressing interest in a certain program to residents. And do people think that that's, a waste of time? Does it depend? And I know we talked about not, overstepping certain boundaries or becoming annoying, but I think that most programs have the residents are involved in the selection process in some way, whether it's formally or informally. Obviously, residents interact with faculty and word travels about who people like or don't like and who's very interested. So even if there is no formal meeting with residents talking about applicants, it's still, I think, will matter to some degree. But I still think that most programs have some kind of meeting where the residents talk about the applicants and put those ideas down on paper. I don't think I really maximized my contact with residents as much as I could have, especially at the programs I was really interested in. If I could apply again, that might be something I would do differently. But what does everyone else think about this? And, how might this apply to your program?
I think, that's a really good question, Andy. I think Dr. Fickey addressed this a little bit in some earlier sessions. I think, that there should be an emphasis on staying in touch with residents because ultimately, what they say about you, what the chief say about you, what the juniors say about you travels up to the chief, and what the chief hears about you goes up to the attending who's going to be evaluating you. And I think it's very important that you stay in touch with the people who are going to have an impact, obviously, who you work closest with, and we're going to have an impact in the final say of whether you get an interview there or not. That's one point. I think the other point is after you finish like a sub-I and a way rotation and you're about to, enter the interview cycle, post-interview correspondence, this was a huge issue, like not an issue, but a huge topic that came out yesterday. I think what the consensus, what Dr. Fickey also mentioned yesterday was you could send thank yous. That's welcome. But a lot of these programs are going to have lukewarm responses to thank you notes just based on NRMP guidelines, and this should not dishearten anybody. That's why I think the primary recommendation is stay in touch with the residents because they're your point of communication with the program, not even the faculty. And obviously the program authority is a very important component of that too. So that would kind of be my general recommendation, just bouncing up ideas that were mentioned earlier in this webinar series.
Yeah, I think
go for it.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Mike.
No, go
Well, I was going to say real quickly that when it comes to post-interview contact with programs or contact with programs in general, I cannot overemphasize that you need a mentor who's going to call for you. That mentor calling for you, that point of contact is worth so much more than any point of contact that you have. So just develop these relationships early.
I would just say that the residents have a tremendous impact in neurosurgery, and I'm sure ortho. I mean, these are long residency programs. They're not just for 2 or 3 years or whatnot. And so these are your brothers and sisters for the next 5 to 7 years, and you want to make sure that you're working with somebody that you could trust and get along with at their worst moment. And so you're going to be at your worst moment, they're going to be at their worst moment, and you want to make sure that you could jive together. And so, it's a culture building kind of, experience when you're picking residents, because it's not just the smartest or the brightest or the most hardworking, it's also kind of their personality and how you want your residency program to develop and what culture you want it to have. And that's, there's no way you could kind of feel that out on an application or even an interview. But when you do a sub-I, you get that experience, which is why, picking your sub-Is is so critical. But I'm convinced that's how I got into UCSF. I mean, I was told I didn't have the best board scores or the best grades, and I definitely didn't come from the best med school. And so, but I did a sub-I there, I did research there, and for some reason, the light was shining on me, and they really enjoyed being with me, and that was what pushed me to get into the program, and that they were very, later on I figured that out. Luckily, they didn't tell me until I was there for a while, but yeah, I mean, it's so important. So our residents, they sit down, they have their own match meeting, and they get to kind of, almost ignoring the application itself, just based on how they've gotten to know the residents, who's in their top, middle, and bottom third, and then they get even a chance to, if there's something that's inappropriate or something that just didn't feel right, they kind of put them on a, almost like do not rank list. And I would also say that, anything that happens with anybody that communicate with administrators, nurses, other physicians throughout your experience in a residency interviewing / sub-I, any of those people could have a major say in kind of that role. And so there's no specific person that you need to be nice to. You need to be nice to like every person that you meet along the trail.
I love all
100% reiterate that.
Go ahead.
I mean, if you get DNR'd or do not ranked by the residents, I mean, that is just game over. I mean, DNR for the residents is horrendous, because they don't want to hire somebody that's going to work with these people for 7 years. And the connections with residents are super important. I went to Rutgers and then ended up getting in Pittsburgh, which is one of the largest neurosurgery programs. And when I interviewed, the residents looked at my application. They were the ones who actually deep down dove into my application, and they saw that I listed martial arts on there because I owned a martial arts studio. And I remember the chief at that time, his name was Captain Philip Von Perry. I think he's a little bit higher now, but he was like, "You don't do martial arts. Look at you. Like, there's no way." And I told them, well, integrity is a hallmark for martial arts, so I do. I was like, let's go punch for punch. And I don't think only at Pittsburgh this would happen, but he's like, okay. So I said, you hit me first. So he hit me, and then I said, is it my turn? He's like, yeah. So I punched him, and then lo and behold, I matched at Pittsburgh. So that doesn't happen anymore. But it is true. The residents are so powerful. I mean, so powerful.
I love that story, and I think everything's been spot on that's been said. And common questions come up, and it really goes back to these notion of soft skills, right? How do you maintain relationships, and even how do you develop relationships, i.e. before a sub-I? How do you maintain relationships during your sub-I and then afterwards? And I think we kind of get stuck in the silo of like the hierarchy, right? Like, I'm the student, you're the resident, you're the attending, whatever. But really, we're all just people at the end of the day, right? And we're just along the spectrum of our training and our experience above all else. And and while resident me was driving around in a Scion, and I now drive a slightly different car, the reality is that I'm still the same person that I was. I just have a few more gray hairs on my head. But with all of that, keep the relationships you forge, really nurture them, because you never know who's going to be a colleague, who's going to be a faculty member at your institution, who you're going to do fellowship with, etc., who you might collaborate with. And the more you can allow these relationships to go, that's how you identify who's going to end up being mentors and potentially sponsors also. I will say that the residents do play a large role, a much larger role than people often might think about, and getting to know them. And it's the reason why I value their opinion a lot too, is because they are the ones you're likely, as Dr. Ivan was mentioning, you're learning from your fellow residents probably the most, right? You learn a lot from your attendings, but you're with the residents, your fellow residents, the most. And you spend the most time with them, right? You're going, like I always like to say, you're going to battle with them, taking down one fracture dislocation at a time. And the challenge is, like, it's the attendings are not in the trenches most of the time, teaching you XYZ different techniques or maneuvers or whatever, right? But sometimes you are, sometimes they're not, but your fellow residents are. And that's why their input and how you fit with them becomes so important. So you can look to learn a lot from them, and how you can also best navigate this process successfully too.
Thank you, Dr. Iyer. So much great insight and advice coming from this session. It's awesome. We have a really interesting question I was asked in the chat. How do programs view mentors from other specialties advocating for a mentee, like a general surgeon who is, reaching out to another program advocating for somebody applying into orthopedics? I think that's interesting. I personally always knew I wanted to do ortho, so I didn't have a situation where I had people from other specialties who I worked with a lot. But for the faculty on the call, just curious to hear what you guys think about that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously everybody, it's always good to hear from other physicians and surgeons that have worked with you. There's no question. But it means the most coming from somebody that is in your field, in your own specialty, and particularly somebody that if you know. And it's not that hard. I mean, ortho, neurosurgery, derm, all these specialties are quite small. And then, in the academic world, there's even smaller amount of people within the medical schools that you're working with, right? And so chances are they're going to know somebody. And if somebody who's been in an experience that you could recognize with, and you know them, and they're saying something good, I mean, that has the best bang for its buck.
It's a great point. I think that it also, it's ideal if the person reaching out is in the same specialty. It's also ideal if that person knows people who are involved in the selection process at the other program. You as an applicant might not always be aware of who knows who, but I think that one thing that could be helpful is, everyone's bio is online, and you can see where they trained and how recently, and you can be assured that if someone trained somewhere within the past 5 or 10 years or even longer than that, they still have connections at the program they trained at, assuming they were well liked, which most people probably are. And so, if it's good to kind of have a general idea of who your mentors might know. And certainly you can ask them about that kind of stuff also. But, not everyone is in the position that they have people in the same specialty who are advocating for them on their behalf, and you should use the resources that you have. But as Dr. Ivan said, it's probably best if they're in the same specialty at the least.
Those great thoughts, Dr. Harris and Dr. Ivan. And I want to ask Dr. Sathpathy, what her take is on the dermatology side of this equation, because I think, obviously a lot of similar nuances, especially in competitive specialties. But what was her experience going through the match this past year in terms of this advocacy piece and having people reach out, and then also what she has seen of her co-residents or even other, fellow applicants from the last cycle?
Yeah, so I think basically everything we've talked about pretty much mirrors what I've seen in dermatology, especially in terms of kind of what we've already talked about in terms of getting along with the residents, because I don't think kind of like what was mentioned, medical students really realize how much residents can contribute to shedding a positive light on medical students in terms of their rank list. And I will kind of echo what was said before, in that it's really important to have strong mentorship relationships with faculty, whether that be at your home institution or fostering them at away rotations. From my experience, since I interviewed during the first COVID cycle, that was a little bit harder on my end because we didn't have away rotations in person. So one way that I kind of approached finding faculty mentors was reaching out to programs that I was really interested in and actually starting research projects with them, because not only did that help me create relationships with the residents, but it also kind of gave me access to the faculty as well. And they were able to see that I was interested in dermatology research and also forging connections with that program. And I think that's something that would help this cycle as well, because I know although in-person away rotations have started again, I think that's a good way to start building relationships with other programs.
Awesome.
There was one other question too that I saw pop up, which was, you only get to do away rotations at a few programs. How do you build these relationships and exposure beyond that, beyond the interview? And, for neurosurgery, we do encourage people, if they are really interested in programs and they don't really feel like they got enough time there to do second looks. I'm not sure if the other specialties do that, but there's no better way to kind of show your commitment than to take another weekend or another 3 or 4 days out of your schedule before or after the interviews to kind of come and visit a place and try to, work, see the residents, meet the residents, and kind of show your interest.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think if you are able to, especially now that away is being back, and the last couple of years have thrown everything for a loop, but if the program will allow you to shadow even for a hot minute, I think it can be extremely advantageous to get a feel for the program, especially if you do not did not have a chance to do an away at that particular place, and that can be a game changer, especially if they haven't done the rank list yet. But again, everyone's different whether they will allow that or not. Some places will, some places won't. So you definitely, you can ask about this, especially right after your interview is done. And if you're going to do it at a particular location, you want to do it right away, because if as Dr. Harris was alluding to earlier, if they're going to do their rank list pretty quickly after all the interviews are done, there will be some motion, there'll be some movement here and there, but probably not a lot before they actually have to turn in their rank list. So getting in to try to have that second look, as Dr. Ivan mentioned, make an impact, getting it done sooner rather than later is probably a good idea.
There's a question in the Q&A. Determining fit for residents is so dependent on the away rotation. How do reapplicants who can't do aways mitigate their inability to show the team the type of person they are? And that's a very tough question, because you're right. Dr. Sethabathy mentioned it's difficult to essentially show your interest if you don't have away rotations. That being said, what she did, reaching out with research projects, starting initiatives, getting that networking component. I could finish a research project even though I'm not in the same place as you are. Showing your work ethic and initiative is one way you could circumvent that. And also working with someone closely in the team is also a good way to see that, get an insight, how well do you fit with the resident leading the project at that institution? And all it takes is one person at that institution to connect you with everyone else outside that institution. So I think it's you need an in if you don't have an away rotation, and once you have that in and you've demonstrated your work ethic to get that in, that one person can connect you with a plethora of other people at that institution, and it's like a self-propagating cycle. That's how I would approach that situation.
Awesome. Well, we're about 5 minutes over our time, I think. I don't want to cut it short if anyone has more comments or things to add, but this was a great session. Thank you all for staying tuned. It seems like our numbers have stayed strong the whole time, so we didn't put too many people to sleep.
Thanks, Dr. Harris. Thanks, Dr. Sethabathy, Dr. Agarwal, Dr. Ivan, for taking the time to be with us today and share your insight. We'll be starting our next session in just a couple of minutes. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
And thanks, Dr. Harris, for moderating.
Hi, everyone. We're going to get going and get started with the next session, how to demonstrate interest in a program after your interview date. I like to do a quick introduction of our panelists. We have Dr. Sheetal Sethupathi. She's a dermatology resident at St. Louis University School of Medicine. We have Dr. Drew Smith. He's an ENT resident at Texas Tech. We have Emily Shu, who's an ophthalmology resident at The Ohio State University. And Dr. Asil Dib, the first-year orthopedic surgery resident at CMC, will be moderating the session. Thank you all for taking the time to join us today. Asil, please take it away.
Thank you, Krishna. Alrighty, so here we're going to be talking about how to communicate with a program at the post-interview phase, which is probably a question we all had around like a few months ago, especially me personally. And it's always pretty vague. So many programs say they do not participate in the post-interview communication. Please do not reach out to us. However, you still get that 1 or 2 or 3 programs that will come at you with an email or a phone call asking you what your thoughts are, how you're planning to rank them. So how did you navigate this? Let's go with Dr. Drew Smith first. When you were applying and deciding how to interview, communicate in the post-interview phase, how did you handle any sort of situations that may have happened like those?
I think the most important thing first off is if a program specifically states, please do not send any post-interview communication, please don't send thank you notes, then listen. Follow their instructions, number one. Number two, I think it's pretty common to send your number one choice some sort of email letter stating that they are your number one. And I think that's something I would advise. I think that's important. It needs to be a very well-written email, obviously, addressing why that program is your number one, why they're a good fit for you, why you're a good fit for them. And don't necessarily expect any response back. I know in my case, I did receive a response, but I don't think everyone always does. And I don't think you can really read into that either way. Some programs will respond and some won't. Really nothing you can do. And then we may talk about this a little later too, but more on the reapplicant side, I did apply twice, I was a reapplicant. But if you don't match, I would certainly reach out, probably not that first week or even that second week, but after a couple of weeks, reach out to the programs you interviewed with, try and request a meeting with the PD or any sort of feedback to try and learn what you can do better, how you can improve for the next cycle, and to show further interest in that program. So I think those are kind of the 3 pieces of advice I most relied on.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. Anybody have any other comments about this?
I think I'll echo what Dr. Smith was saying. I do think that if a program tells you gives you specific instructions regarding post-interview communication, it is imperative that you follow them because it does show that you are a resident that will follow instructions. And I do think when you're sending your letter of intent, which is commonly what that number one rank email is that you're sending to your program that you're going to rank number one, it's really important that you only send it to one program. And make sure that when you send it, you are certain that that is your number one program, because once you send that, it's kind of written in stone now that you should rank that program number one. I also had some colleagues that I knew from other specialties, other schools, my institution, that we're talking about also sending a number 2 email and saying that the institution was highly ranked. I personally would discourage applicants from sending that and only sending to your number 1, because nobody wants to hear that they're your number 2 pick. People only want to hear that they're number 1. So that would be something that I would add.
I'm going to tag on to what Dr. Sethupathi said about writing emails right away. So first, I think there's the question of timing. When should I send my email? And then 2, should you send your email, which we've addressed, and then 3, who do you send it to? Because some programs, they want you to send it to the program coordinator who will forward the emails to the entire team. So sometimes it's better just to send one email that kind of summarizes, love talking to this attending about this topic. Thank you for letting me share about this topic. So you have one summary email you send to the program coordinator who forwards it to everyone who interviewed you. And it's just very streamlined and very nice that way. And then the first point I talked about, timing. It's really important because as we've learned from these sessions, sometimes programs rank right away, right after the session ends, they all get together and they start talking. So you need to send your thank you email right away. Sometimes you even need to pre-write your thank you email. So you get a template ready, you look up everyone that you're going to interview with ahead of time, and you can sometimes like already start getting an outline ready, and then definitely add in some specific anecdotes. Thank you for letting me talk about my global health initiatives, et cetera, et cetera. So then you can have everything ready to go. Send it right away because sometimes it'll be too late if you send it, a week later, a day later.
So I appreciate all these sentiments, and I will just I'll take what Dr. Xu was saying kind of in a different direction. So I personally am not a fan of thank you notes because I think that they're very, you're hoping and praying that you're going to get some sort of feedback, right, from the program you're sending the thank you note for. And there's always like, should I handwrite them? Should I like send like a gift basket? Like, like, should I Venmo something? Like, whatever. What I would say is that these people that you're engaging with, so I do think timing is important, as Dr. Xu mentioned, but I will say it's important to follow instructions. But I would also say, if you have the opportunity, don't send a thank you note, but send a, hey, it was great to meet you. Like, let's stay in touch. Because this is an opportunity to meet future partners. And I've said this a few times, I have future partners, future like colleagues, future fellowship directors, whatever. You never know who is going to be where at whatever point in time. So as an example, and I mentioned this yesterday, but with Dr. Ficky, my chair, I met him at a conference I was putting on like 2-3 years ago at this point, and he was speaking about mentorship at the conference. He was an invited speaker. And then obviously that being a passion of mine, I like went up to him and said hello. I was like, hey, we'd love to talk to you sometime. Let's stay connected. Exactly what happened. So now we're back and forth with emails. I got him involved a little bit with OrthoMentor early on. And then fast forward in June of 2020, I get a call while visiting my parents in California. We want you to come up here. And I'm like, wait, what? And so you just never know how these conversations, even if it's in the context of ERAS, right? You just never know how it's going to play out. So I would encourage sharing so send these emails. I think send them if you're able to, but use it as a springboard for further connection and networking opportunity, because you never know where things are going to go.
Thank you. All very thoughtful remarks. And one thing I would like to echo, I think Dr. Sethupathi, please correct me if I said that incorrectly, mentioned it, is only sending that number 1. And if it does change, that can put you in a little bit of a sticky situation, given the fact that if you tell someone that you're, oh yeah, hey, I'm ranking you number 1, but in fact you don't, and then you match somewhere else and they find out, that could cost you a fellowship in the future or any sort of further opportunities or even a job down the line, because people don't forget that. So only say it if you're genuine and you actually mean it, because people do take that very seriously and it's not lightly at all. So moving on to the next question. What are the most appropriate ways to communicate in the post-interview phase? Do you send it by mail? Do you send it by email? Do you let someone call on your behalf, or do you make that phone call? What are ways that you all think are the best way to do so? Go with Dr. Sethupathi, if you want to start off.
Yeah, so I think the best way, sorry, just to clarify about post-interview communication, correct? I think the best way to communicate I'll start off with a caveat. Post-interview communication can sometimes be a sticky subject because due to like NRMP rules, it kind of limits like what a program is allowed to say to you and kind of limits what you're allowed to say to a program. So I think keeping that in mind, the best way to contact a program would be like through a mentor. like having a strong, like a mentor that you have a strong relationship with, reaching out and maybe putting a good word in for you or letting the program know that you're interested. I think that bears more weight than you saying it yourself. That being said, I mean, obviously send your letter of intent if you're interested in a program. But I think having faculty to faculty communication is key post-interview, if that's something that you want a program to know.
I would absolutely second that. In fact, after my interview at The Ohio State University, my mentor sent me a text saying, this person who interviewed you loved you. So they had communicated to each other, and then my mentor communicated to me. So a lot of these communications do happen behind the scenes from mentor to mentor.
I will echo that, because I have been on the receiving end of the text, and here's the tricky part, because NRMP, right, is designed to support y'all as the students. So you're never supposed to rank based on what you think the program is supposed to do. I am going to share with you, though, that sometimes, however, if you have a sort of sense from a program that someone is really well liked, and you're trying to be very strategic with that individual, then you need to kind of talk to said student about that, right? And to some extent, because it could be the difference between someone matching and not matching, conceivably. And those are very fine lines. It takes a lot of bouncing act for sure. But yes, that does happen. And I think the faculty to faculty communication is huge. That's because now, I mean, STEP's gone to pass fail, grade's gone to pass fail. I've said this a zillion times in the past couple of days. We want to know, like, is the letter you've written real, or is it just fluff for ERAS? And if it's real, then tell me about why is this person great? I get those calls. I've asked others about this, and and the reality is this communication is happening whether you realize it or not. So I definitely agree on this post-interview side. Take full advantage of those people who are going to make those calls. Define that now. Don't wait till do not assume, that's the biggest thing I'll tell you, do not assume that your letter writers are going to be the ones making those phone calls. The assumption that that's going to happen is what has been a dagger for many in this past cycle who did not match and were super competitive on paper, had multiple interviews, etc. It was the lack of advocacy that was a common thread, as I've shared with many people, that led to probably their match demise, unfortunately. So with that in mind, define now, as you're figuring out who's going to write your letters, in the same breath, ask, are you willing? They say, yes, I'm going to totally write your letter, whatever. Great. Would you be willing to support and advocate for me when it comes time to interviews and when it comes time to rank? And ask that now. That, oh yeah, absolutely, happy to make phone calls on your behalf. Let's meet up to go over programs I think you ought to consider. That strategy is critical now, not something you should be figuring out when you're making your rank list. Because at that point, I don't know if I really can or feel comfortable, and now you're chasing your tail as a result. So just again, from the faculty perspective, want to throw that in there.
And just to add one more detail to that, notice that this post-interview communication, it's not going to be to all the programs that you literally just applied to. This is a very focused subset of the top programs you're interested in that your faculty mentor is going to be reaching out to you on your behalf. Because ultimately, if they reach out for you at every single program, you're diluting their word, and that's the value of that word goes down. But it's very specific programs that you've identified for valid reasons why you want to go to that program, compared to your whole other application list that your faculty mentor is going to be advocating for you at after the interview. So that's a very serious point, because ultimately you don't want your faculty mentor to make you calls at 30 programs. It should be a subset of programs that you are very specifically interested in.
Awesome. And I know this seminar is titled as post-interview interest demonstration, but your interest can start way before interviews even happen. So if there's a place that you're really interested in, or a couple places, that's definitely an avenue that you should explore and reach out and make sure that's demonstrated. Speak to the residents, speak to the faculty that are available and willing to speak back with you, because that can further just tailor your application strength when it comes down to interviews, and you send that post-interview remark like, okay, yeah, this person's serious. They're not just saying it right now and have been ignoring the process the entire time. So what are some inappropriate ways that you've heard of people communicating in the post-interview period? Dr. Iyer, I'll give that to you.
I would probably say that, you know, I've had some students who, so as I've shared with people, pretty much anyone who reaches out, and it's been across, it's been opto, it's been derm, it's been ENT, it's been urology, every specialty. I've had people reach out to at least chat because they don't necessarily feel supported at the institution they're at. And you know, and while I feel very humbled and honored, I also feel, you know, a little bit saddened that the disparities still exist even now. But with all that being said, it's probably in those instances when, and I've had several of them, where I've had one-off conversations, and I would call them not, you know, people say, oh, you mentor all these people. I'm like, no, I don't mentor like everybody. It doesn't make any sense. I probably advise a lot more people than I mentor, which is, you know, really the case. But people will ask me, hey, do you mind reaching out to a program on my behalf? And I've basically just talked to them in, you know, like for a couple of times. They've like texted me for advice. They've like called me for advice on occasion. And it's purely more like transactional, which is fine, because that is in some cases all that's, you know, someone requires, and that's okay. But to me, if I'm reaching out on behalf of someone, it usually is predicated by having gotten to know them, having gotten to work with them in some capacity or another, and then having a mutual respect and appreciation for what they bring to the table. So it's not about selling them, but I myself will want to see them sort of succeed, grow, and, you know, prosper in whatever discipline they're going into. And obviously, if someone is not like a non-ortho asking me to make a call on their behalf, that's a little bit, you know, contrived, because while I may know people in non-orth that are not orthopedic, you know, it's hard for me to comment on the clinical acumen, if you will, as an example. But even more so, if I've not even done any work with you, then I think that's really like a hard ask. So that's probably the most common circumlocutic way of getting to the point that I would make sure, if you're asking people to make phone calls on your behalf or whatever else, make sure it's people who you've worked with in some capacity or another. I know it can be very anxiety provoking, this whole process. You feel like you're grasping at straws, but that's why these kinds of internal conversations, like way ahead of time, are important. So you can strategize who's going to try to help you. But that's probably one example I can think of off the top of my head. I'll let the others kind of share their thoughts of what they've seen other applicants do, if you will, having gone through it recently. And then I'll dig a little deeper and think if I can come up with some other, see if I can remember any other crazy ones.
I don't know if I have any examples of really bad ways of like reaching out, but I will kind of echo what Dr. Iyer said, how if you want someone to reach out for you, it's really important that you have like an organic mentorship relationship with them, that they've seen you work, like for example in dermatology, they've seen you work hard in clinic, and you know, maybe you're doing research with them and they see how strong of a work ethic you have. For example, when I was going through my application cycle, I worked in one of the attendings clinics, and I hopped on a research project with them. And although they weren't my like mentor in the department, perhaps, they were still open to communicating to other programs on my behalf. But that relationship was created in an organic manner. They knew me, they knew my personality, they knew my work ethic. And I think that's a good way of having faculty reach out on your behalf.
Dr. Shu, Dr. Smith, any interesting stories of what people have done, whether it be the best case scenario or worst case scenario?
I think in the biggest thing I have heard from attendings, haven't necessarily seen myself, is just the sending, you're my number one to every program. And they apparently they remember that, and you know, can think of specific examples, and you know, now this person's kind of blacklisted from our institution in the future, which is, you know, kind of a bummer. So I think and it's already been said, but I'll just echo it. Only send it to your number one. I agree, not sending you're my number two. No one wants to be number two. So I think the most important things have been said. I'll just echo those as well.
I think I have a story. Luckily, I was able to prevent the student from doing this. But I think common sense is common sense, and we're all professional. And to address post-interview communication, it has to be done in a very professional way. So that being said, so you know how email addressees like this, when you sign your mail, like mine has my cell phone number on it. So apparently one of the students I was talking to got an email from a faculty that he interviewed with, added the cell phone number. He's like, Christian, is it okay if I text the faculty member for saying thank you for interviewing? And immediately I was like, no, this is not professional. You have to email if you want to say thank you. So that's common sense, right? Like you should never be texting a faculty member that you met for a 15-minute student interview. But these are things that we get asked. So please, professionalism is something we have to emphasize throughout this whole process and throughout your whole career, not just residency application.
It's very true. I want to introduce Dr. Don LaPorte, one of my partner and our residency program director here at Hopkins for orthopedics. And Dr. LaPorte, what we are speaking about is sort of the don'ts of kind of post-interview communication. If you have especially as a PD, if there's certain messages you've received over the years that you're like, that probably wasn't the best thing to send, or whether it be from student or faculty, kind of examples of that. I'll give you a second to think about it. I recently got a blitz of texts and phone calls from a student who had gone unmatched. And literally this individual I don't even know where they had gotten my phone number from. My number's probably floating around the internet at this point. But it was I had asked, I said, why are you calling? And out of desperation, right? They really wanted to seek answers and try to strategize, etc. And I shared with that person that, in the future, I would at least send an email as opposed to just taking every sort of known way of communicating and just reaching out, because you never know with whom you're going to burn a bridge. And while I have maintained communication with this person, others may very well not. It may have been very off-putting for them. But I would say, just to Dr. Suresh's point, that's a big no-no also. Kind of be very professional in any of your approaches, even if it's out of desperation, because things are a little bit challenging.
So I completely agree with that. I think most people will respond to an email. I would just, on that note, if you email somebody and you don't hear back, do email again. Your program directors, faculty are busy. It doesn't mean that they don't want to respond. They just may have missed it. So definitely okay to send another email. Be professional, be gracious, be, maybe overly thankful and appreciative of people's time. I don't think that will ever serve you wrong. But going back to, I guess, the question of after interviews and in the match process, is that kind of where we're at? So one, if a program tells you at the interview that their faculty do not do any post-interview communication, then you should respect that, and your communication should be with the residents. That's a really nice opportunity. If the residents are not involved in the interview process, then it's completely appropriate to communicate with the residents. I can't even think of what a question that you might have would be, but you can also go, if the residents can't answer it, and they can pretty much answer everything. You could go to the program coordinator. That's also somebody who's fair and safe and pretty much knows everything going on, and has the ear of the program director or associate program director if it's something that needs to be bumped up. And same thing, I think we talked a little yesterday about how we definitely talk to the residents and listen a lot to what they have to say. It really matters a lot. So communicating with the residents who you connected with either at the interview or if you spent a month there is really helpful. If you are gonna, some programs do engage in emails and the like afterwards. If a faculty member tells you, you can text them, then you can text them. But I think I would always start with email because it's safest and maybe most professional. So again, just my own opinion, but that's my gestalt. And you probably can't go wrong with that. Always better to be safe.
Yeah, I completely agree with all of that. And, it's, you can talk, if you don't feel comfortable, like with certain people, ask, your felt like students who you knew who just graduated went through it, ask, the residents, as the residency coordinator, as Dr. LaPorte mentioned, and as we talked about earlier too. I think or ask or reach out to us, right? I've literally had I had a student from a prominent institution who did not match, and the biggest issue was that that person had not reached out to they had been advised by their residents at that institution to not advocate for themselves, to not say anything specifically. And this person is, kind of follows OrthoMentor and all that stuff. And I asked what ended up happening. Did you talk to your home program? And home program told the student, why didn't you ever reach out to us? Like what happened? And of course, the student ends up not matching at all. So, if there's questions, reach out, ask, and that's what, try to like get a lifeline, and, we can help in some way, shape or form. So just keep that in mind as you're navigating through it.
One more thing, and you guys probably already mentioned this, but certainly, when it comes down to you're putting your list in, what your top program is. There's, your advocates, your mentor can reach out to those programs. So that's where the connection can come to the program director or to, a key faculty member at the program. So don't not advocate for yourself. It just may be the role for your mentor to do that. And like Dr. Iyer just said, we're a resource. And if somebody were to reach out to me and they were applying to Hopkins too, I can very easily, be very neutral. So it's fair to reach out to us regardless of what programs you're interested in. We really want the best for all of you.
I agree. And I can speak from my personal experience. I mean, Dr. LaPorte and Dr. Iyer are both two big mentors for me. And when I was navigating the process, in all honesty, I was able to talk about my entire rank list and how I wanted to communicate. And it should be in full transparency that you discuss that with your mentors and shouldn't feel any way, shape, or form hindered from doing so. So having those open, honest conversations are definitely recommended. I'm sure in other seminars and sessions, you all have discussed this, but one question that came up in the chat, what are your thoughts on how to find advocates if you do not have a home ortho program or department in making these phone calls? What do you all suggest? Let's go with you, Dr. Shu.
I think the first thing, if you don't have a home program, is to try to get exposure early. Try to get exposure to other programs nearby. If you have another program in the same town as you, try to start doing research with them, getting exposure, going to grand rounds, meeting people at conferences, doing anything you can to get your foot in the door. And that helps you open the door further to meet more people. I think the important thing is to start early. It's kind of hard if you're going to do it when you really, really need it late.
I'll echo what Dr. Shu said. I think I kind of touched on this in the previous session, but I interviewed for dermatology residency during the first round of COVID interviews. So I think one way to demonstrate interest, specifically like if you don't have mentors, would be to reach out to a few programs that you're really interested in. And what I did is I hopped on some research projects with a couple programs that I was really interested in, and that helped me get to know the residents. It helped me get to know the faculty, and it also gave me the opportunity to present research at their grand rounds or during their resident didactic sessions, and that really helps get your foot in the door and get to know some of these programs.
Yeah, I think as someone who has kind of observed this process and how it's changed a lot over the last several years, from the time I didn't match to all the way to now, I can't speak enough about the value of finding the people who are going to be in your corner. And a lot of us keep harping on research years, in part because many of us did them. ironically, Asil and I, when she was going through this process, last year, I suggested to Dr. Div that, hey, this is something you may want to consider. And it was something we talked about. I know she talked to others too, including Dr. LaPorte, about the value of that. And kind of removing from her situation specifically, the research, if you do not have, like, if you don't have a home program, you've not been a part of any pipeline programs or have not established any connections locally or regionally, then a research year gives you ample time to do that at a particular institution. So even beyond that of the research itself, which is obviously helpful to kind of understand the field a little bit more, conceivably scrub in if you're a student, or scrub into OR if you're in an operative environment, or in a clinical environment if you're something that's non-operative in nature. I definitely think that it adds a lot of value beyond that of the actual CV boost itself. So don't not think about that. Advanced degrees can also be beneficial in some sense because they can add to sort of the strength academically. But strength academically, but it may be a little bit harder to get involved with a given department of interest, right? Unless they're really dovetail well together in terms of, hey, like mutual interest there. But those can be alternate ways, especially if you're looking at something competitive like derm, like opto, like ortho, like neurosurg, like plastics, et cetera, and you are making that decision late. Looking back, having not matched and done the research here afterwards, I wish I could go back, slap myself across the face and say, you're going to do the research here now after third year, as opposed to, oh, I don't want to not graduate and this and that, because reality is I don't know if I'd be here right now, but suffice to say that I probably would have had a better chance at matching the first time around as opposed to the second had I done the research here ahead of time. Again, and I'll finish by saying this, I can safely attest to the fact that research year was a pivotal in my career development, pivotal. And the person that I was in touch with at that point in time is still like someone I talk to on a non-infrequent basis. We text not infrequently. If I have a student who wants to connect in whatever way, shape, or form, he'll be okay for me to connect him with anyone right off the bat. And so I definitely think it's a huge long-term play, and that's something to kind of remember. There's the forest behind the trees mentality when you're thinking about it.
And just to add on to that, what Dr. Iyer just said, and this came up in the previous session as well. This isn't a research year. Like, I did a research between my third and fourth year of medical school, and it's becoming more and more commonplace to do this for competitive specialties. And it's an investment. I'm telling you, it's a year. It's an additional year. I agree with that, but it's an investment towards your future for the long-term gains that just Dr. Iyer just mentioned. The relationship you will build from doing a research year and doing a good job in that research year will span your career, not just the duration of that year. So it's an investment, and please consider that before you rule it out.
I agree. I think we're going ahead of time. So if anybody has any final remarks, please feel free to share. But I really want to extend my greatest gratitude to all the panelists for joining us. Really grateful for all of you and your time, and everybody for participating. Any final remarks?
I'll jump in and just say thanks to everybody for really a great 2-day session, to Dr. Satpathy, Dr. Smith from LaPorte, Dr. Shu, Dr. Div for hosting and moderating this session, and Dr. Suresh for all his help for the last 2 days, and Dr. Pandya for working with us behind the scenes, and our entire Momentum team. We really thank everyone here right now, all the attendees. It's been an incredible experience. We hope you enjoyed the information. Remember, even though a lot of us are ortho involved, it's all applicable across the board, right? It's not, there's probably certain nuances that that are going to be slightly different, whether you're doing opto, plastics, ENT, derm, whatever, but by and large, the information is very similar. Don't hesitate to reach out. Take the chance to ask questions, take the chance to connect, take the chance to think outside the box in terms of opportunity, but don't let especially now that we're so much more connected in this digital age, don't hesitate and don't miss out on the opportunity to get connected with any of us, any of the panelists, We really do appreciate your time and commitment on the panelist side, faculty side, but also the attendees for sticking with us for the last 2 days.
Awesome. Thank you all.
We will be making our way into transitioning into our closing remarks with Dr. LaPorte momentarily.
Dr. LaPorte, we could wait just a couple minutes for people to transition and then we can get started. Thank you so much.
That's good. Thank you. Can I attempt to share my screen? Just get to the
Yep.
slide. All right.
Yep.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amitabh Iyer, and I am one of the founders of Momentum and the founder of OrthoMentor, for those of you who did not know. And it is with absolute privilege and honor that I introduce our final speaker for this 2-day boot camp that is in its inaugural year. Dr. Don LaPorte is, orthopedic hand surgeon, Hopkins legacy individual, and has been program director for several years in the residency in orthopedic surgery here at Johns Hopkins. I actually got to know Dr. LaPorte a couple years ago when a mutual colleague actually had said I needed to reach out to Dr. LaPorte from Hopkins about a concept I was developing at the time entitled OrthoMentor. And just not even knowing anything really about Dr. LaPorte up until that time, I can safely tell you that not only did I get a very prompt response, but we were in either a phone call or a Zoom call maybe within the next couple of weeks, and immediately I knew how committed to education, how committed to orthopedic surgery, how committed to her residents, how committed an individual that she was. And since that point in time, nearly probably 2 years ago now, Dr. LaPorte and I have had we've had a blossoming relationship and friendship, and collaborative in terms of we've got a lot of stuff that's been published together in a variety of different platforms. We've done a lot of work together on the OrthoMentor side. She's now getting involved with our Momentum side of things as this evolves. And it is, I am so humbly honored to be able to not only call her, a partner, but to call this esteemed professor, accolades galore, a dear friend and colleague. So without further ado, I want to introduce Dr. Dawn LaPorte, Professor of Orthopedic Surgery and Orthopedic Residency Director at Johns Hopkins University. Thank you, Dr. LaPorte.
Wow, I think I will just retire on that. Thank you very much. Thank you for including me in this program. It's a true honor to talk to all of you this afternoon. I'd like to start with first and most importantly, saying a huge thank you to Drs. Iyer, Suresh, Panya, and the entire organizing team for this amazing Momentum Bootcamp. It was an information-packed 2 days and was really incredible to see nearly 2,000 students registered. I know that you'll all be leaving with some helpful pearls and information for the application process. And why am I not advancing? Sorry, ranging from how to write a personal statement. You start with something catchy so they want to read more, tell your story and make it memorable. Know your anatomy and read about things that you see but that you don't know. Rock your away rotation by working hard, come early and stay late, be helpful and a team player and be nice to everyone. Be thoughtful about who and how to ask for a letter of recommendation. You learn tips for how to navigate ERAS and how to make your rank list, and had a really good discussion about how to approach preference signaling this cycle. Talk to your mentor, your program director, and your classmates, and be thoughtful and don't step on each other's toes. Probably the most important recurrent message and theme the past 2 days has been the importance of mentorship and making connections, and that can't be emphasized enough. Mentorship is essential to ensuring that we have a competent, caring, compassionate future generation of doctors. The term mentor comes to us from Greek mythology. Mentor was a good friend of Odysseus, and when he went to fight in the Trojan War, he entrusted a mentor to care for and educate his son, Telemachus. Mentorship is bidirectional, but a large part of it is helping to bring someone to the next level, to achieve their goals, and often to achieve goals that they couldn't even envision as possible for themselves. Momentum and OrthoMentor before that has really revolutionized mentorship for medical education. The Momentum program provides resources and mentorship through residents and faculty for all students who are applying to residency. And many of you may be in programs where it's easy to find a mentor and make that connection, but some of you have certainly had to work very hard for that. And so Momentum aims to level the playing field. It aims to provide critical resources and answer important questions for everyone. We're all where we're at now because of our mentors. One of my favorite quotes is, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants," from Sir Isaac Newton over 400 years ago. Dr. David Green, who wrote Green's Hand Surgery, gave his presidential address at the American Society for Surgery of the Hand in 2005, titled "On the Shoulders of Mortals." He said that we're all mentors. Your mentor can, but doesn't have to be a giant. Peers and family members are mentors. Medical students can be great mentors. We learned through the pandemic that your mentor doesn't have to be in your home program or in your local community, but they can be anywhere across the country or around the world. Residents, junior or senior residents, can be phenomenal mentors. And you've seen a glimpse of that through the outstanding residents that participated in the Momentum Bootcamp program. There's been increased attention to the importance of mentorship in the literature, and more faculty are committing to being mentors and to trying to be better mentors. We actually had a CORD, Council of Orthopedic Residency Directors, webinar dedicated fully to advising medical students and the importance of mentorship. There are, of course, multiple online resources that students can go to learn about different programs during the application process. But hearing from an individual and your mentor is the gold standard, right? Better to hear from somebody directly who's been there than to learn from the Google Doc or from the Doximity Residency Navigator. And that's something this article talked about. Studies have shown that people who have mentors perform better, progress in their career faster, and even have better satisfaction with their work-life experience. You can find mentors in many different ways. Many of the national organizations have resources to connect you with a mentor and have medical student dedicated programming. And so if you're looking for mentorship or even just networking outside of your home program, you look to Momentum, but also look to some of these national organizations, which can also be helpful. Dr. Iyer mentioned this in his introduction yesterday, but orthopedics and many of the competitive specialties don't do a great job in representing the demographics of the patients that we take care of. And there are many, many values to increasing diversity in our fields, and mentorship plays a critical role in this. And so Momentum increasing access to mentorship for everybody is really pivotal. We have a lot of way to go. This is a Google search of the term orthopedic surgeon, and there's a little bit of diversity in these pictures. We have made some progress. I think it's important for you all to know that there's no one ideal type of orthopedic or neurosurgery or ENT resident. If I had 30 residents in my program who were clones of Dr. Krishna Suresh, we would probably have a really high board pass rate and excellent research productivity, but we would have 1/30th the amount of new ideas and different perspectives. And that's important. So you don't have to fit a certain mold or be an ideal type to match to the specialty of your choice, although it can be helpful to be hardworking, smart, honest, and nice. But be yourself and be proud of who you are. One of my mentors liked to talk about serendipity, and that sometimes good things just happen when you're not looking for it. And it's important to be open to taking some of those opportunities. When I was a medical student, I knew I was interested in surgery, and I was hoping to get the surgery clerkship for my first rotation. We had a lottery system, and not only did I not get the surgery clerkship, I was assigned to an elective block, so not any clerkship at all. I was frustrated, but I looked through the offerings, and there was one surgical elective that didn't have the prerequisite for the clerkship. So I signed up. It was a hand surgery elective at a local hospital, not even at Johns Hopkins. But I loved the people and the patients and met an amazing mentor, and that had a huge impact on my future career. So enjoy the people that you meet and have the opportunity to work with. You will learn something from everyone that you work with. I chose orthopedics largely because of the people I'd met and interacted with, and many of you may have chosen your field for similar reasons. It's also important to challenge yourself and push yourself. We learn the best at the edge of our comfort zone, or sometimes when we take a step just outside of that comfort zone. Wayne Gretzky said, you miss 100% of the shots that you don't take. So push yourself and see what you can achieve. And it doesn't have to be a huge push or gamble. You don't have to apply to be president of a national society or for an elite traveling fellowship. But if there's a research internship that seems really interesting, apply for it. If you're on your OA and someone asks if you want to present at indications conference or at the department M&M, go for it. Take that opportunity. If they ask if you want to do the reduction or place the traction pin or ream the femur, do it. Take advantage of and seek out opportunities. It's not easy to be the best version of yourself for an entire month or even longer on your OA, or if you have more than one in a row. But you can do it. It's sometimes hard to talk about how great you are in your personal statement or at your interviews, but that's not the time to be modest. What I love the most about participating in programs like this and about my job at Hopkins is the opportunity to meet and interact with outstanding students like you all, and hopefully see you go on to be amazing physicians and do great work. Remember, at the end of the day, it's all about taking excellent care of the patients. So, all right, you've all worked incredibly hard to be where you're at. And I know the application process is scary and stressful, but remember that there are so many people who want to help you navigate the process and achieve your goals and be the best that you can be. Your mentors will often see potential in you that you don't see in yourself. And so I encourage you to take advantage of the resources and reach out to your mentors and connect with your mentors, old and new. The Momentum program and all that it stands for is incredible and critically important. And I think it will change and globally improve mentorship, research, and education across the board. And I'm really proud to be able to be a little part of that. So I wish you all the best with your applications and your careers. The future of medicine and surgery is certainly very bright. Thank you.
Dr. LaPorte, that was really, really amazing. And, you know, you and I have gotten to know each other fairly well over the last couple of years now, and especially as our mutual interests grow here together on campus. And for those of you who are not aware, when I was at, it was actually several of the conversations that Dr. LaPorte and I had while I was still kind of finishing up at Miami that were the big draw for me to, between her and Dr. Fickey, for the reason why I decided to come up here to Baltimore. So really, thank you so much for sharing your insight. Thank you for taking the time. Thank you for really, setting the standard for what we all should be like in our future careers, and really paving the way, not just for orthopedic surgeons, but for women, for underrepresented minorities, going into any field that they're interested in going into. And thank you so much for closing out our day. We really appreciate it.
I just wanted to say thank you so much, Dr. LaPorte. I think as someone who's just starting out in the career in orthopedics, I think the best advice I could give anyone junior to me is find a role model you want to embody and try to strive every moment, every waking moment of your life, trying to embody what they represent. Dr. LaPorte's certainly one of those role models for me. And I think having a mold, having someone to aspire towards is kind of the first steps in succeeding in any career. With that, thank you all for joining our 2-day session. We have a social this evening at 5 p.m. It's 5 to 6 p.m. where we could address any further questions and will give us more time to talk. So please, I encourage all of you to attending the session to make time for that as well. Thank you again, Dr. LaPorte.
Thank you very, very much, you and Dr. Iyer and all of you. You're all awesome. I wish you all the best.
Thanks, everyone. Hope to see you a little bit later.